In April 2006, in the Red Badlands below the Lukachukai Mountains in Apache County, Arizona, a Navajo abandoned mine survey crew found a second set of tracks pressed down inside their own boot prints, toe for toe. 4 of them had driven 30 miles past the last pavement to map the old uranium openings the mining companies punched into the rock and walked away from in the 1950s. The crew boss was Diné, raised on a grandfather's warnings about the things you do not name out loud. By the 3rd day, they knew the prints were no accident. Something had been following their line, stepping where they stepped, stacking their marker rocks back into little towers after they knocked them down. It worked the edges of camp once the sun went down. It answered a radio check in a sound shaped almost like a word, then went quiet. It had been watching them work for 3 days, and it had started doing their work back at them. It was wearing a hide that did not fit the frame underneath it. They tried to drive out and could not. The wind came up hard enough to ground any help and scrub the prints flat, and it cut the open ground between the crew and the truck. Before it was over, it got to one of the crew and mauled him nearly to death. By the end of it, the crew boss was bleeding from his own wounds, alone on open rock, with the thing coming at him at a dead run, and his hand closing on the one thing his people had left him. You are going to want to hear this one all the way through. The account, told by the one who lived it, begins now. Real quick before we start. If true horror is your thing, hit subscribe and like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, let's begin. My name is Eldon itsKreature, and this happened to me back in 2006, out in the Red Valley country below the Lukachukai Mountains on the Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona. I was the crew boss on an abandoned mine survey for the nation's reclamation program. There were 4 of us out there, and the nearest pavement was 30 miles of washboard road behind us. We were 2 days into a 5-day stretch, mapping the old uranium holes the mining companies had punched into the rock back in the 1950s and just walked away from, and everything was only work. Until it wasn't. It started with the rock stacks. We'd been marking our route with little survey cairns, 3 or 4 stones balanced on top of each other so we could find our way back out of the draws. On the 3rd day, every cairn we'd built the day before had been added to. A couple more stones set on top of each one, careful, balanced better than we'd done it ourselves. Doreen Yazzie, who ran our survey gear, figured one of us had topped them off without realizing it. Philip Reardon, the contract engineer the program brought in from off the reservation, said it was probably a kid or a sheep herder. Then I found the tracks at the bottom of the draw, and they were inside our boot prints. Not beside them. Inside them. Whatever made them had set its feet down in the prints we'd left the day before, toe in toe, the whole length of the line, walking exactly where we'd walked. I want to be straight with you about something before I go further, because it matters for how the rest of this went. My mother's people are the Bitter Water clan, and I was born for the Water's Edge people. My grandfather raised me more than my own folks did, and he took the old things seriously without ever making a show of it. He told me there are places out in this country you leave alone. He told me there are things that used to be people that you do not talk about. The worst mistake you can make with one of those is to say its name out loud, or let it learn the sound of your voice. I'm not going to pretend I'd lived my whole life by that. I went to community college. I owned a meter that measured radiation. But everything I did right out there I did because of him, and the one thing that almost got all of us killed, I did because for about a minute I forgot to listen to him. That morning, though, standing over those tracks, I wasn't thinking about my grandfather. I was thinking it was a prank. We get a fair amount of that on closures. People out joyriding. Kids who think it's funny to mess with a government crew. So I crouched down and looked closer, and that's when the prank theory started to come apart. The print at the top of the line was a clean 4-toed track, the kind a big dog leaves. The print at the bottom of the line, maybe 40 feet down the draw, was longer. The toes had stretched out, and at the back of it, there was a heel, pressed deep, almost like a person's heel. Same tracks, same line of travel. The print just changed shape as it went. Doreen came over and looked and didn't say anything for a second. which for Doreen was unusual, because she was 26 and the kind of sharp where she'd correct your grid coordinate and then apologize to you for correcting it. She finally said it was probably 2 different animals that happened to use the same path. I told her that was probably it. Neither one of us believed it, but it was the morning and the light was good, and you can talk yourself into almost anything when the sun's up. I should tell you what the work actually is, because it explains why we were stuck out there and why nobody back home was worried about us yet. Abandoned mine work is not complicated. You drive to a set of old coordinates. You walk the ground with the meter, which clicks faster when it finds the hot dirt the old ore left behind. You flag every opening you come across so the closure crew can fill it later. Most of what we found was nothing. Slumped pits. Caved adits the country was already swallowing back into itself. We had the truck, a generator, a steel shipping container we used for a tool shed and a place to get out of the wind, and a satellite phone, because cell service out there does not exist. We were scheduled to be gone 5 days. That meant if something went wrong on day 3, nobody was going to come looking for 2 more days. I want you to hold on to that. It's the whole reason this story is as long as it is. Loretta Begay was the one who finally said out loud what the rest of us were circling. Loretta had been doing field work longer than I had, somewhere in her 50s, and she was related to me about 4 different ways, which is just how it is out there. We were eating lunch out of the cooler, sitting in the shade on the lee side of the container, and she pointed her chin at the mountains and asked me if I knew what they used to call this drainage. I didn't. She told me her grandmother's generation had a name for it, and it wasn't a name you used after the sun went down. 2 prospectors came out to this exact stretch in the uranium days, she said, and they never came back. A 3rd one came out 30 years after that to look for their old claim, and didn't come back either. Philip laughed. Not mean, just the way he laughed at most of what we told him, like it was a quaint thing he was being patient about. He said people get lost in country like this all the time, and the desert doesn't need a legend to kill you, and he was right about that. That's the part that always got me. He was right, and it didn't matter at all. Here's the thing about Philip. He was good at his job. He could look at a caved adit and tell you how the rock was going to behave when you backfilled it. He just had no use for anything he couldn't put in a report. So when I told the crew that afternoon that I wanted to pack up early and work the eastern openings the next 2 days instead, away from this drainage, Philip pushed back. There was one adit on our list at the head of this draw, an old prospect the records called a working we still hadn't located, and he wanted it flagged before we moved on. He said if we left it unconfirmed, he'd have to drive all the way back out, and the program wouldn't pay for a second trip, and we were already here. I didn't have a real reason to tell him no. Loretta's story wasn't a reason I could write in a report, so I said fine. We'd find the adit, flag it, and clear out the next morning. That decision is the one I've gone back over more times than I can count. We found the adit late that day, or maybe it was the next morning. I've honestly gone back and forth on which. It was set into the base of a red sandstone cliff at the very head of the draw, half hidden behind a slump of rock and a stand of dead-looking brush. The meter went crazy near the mouth, which made sense. That's where they'd have run the ore out. The opening itself was mostly collapsed, just a low gap you'd have to crawl through. Philip wanted it cleared enough to see how far back it ran and whether it needed a steel grate or a full backfill. So we cleared it. Doreen and I pulled rock away from the mouth for the better part of an hour while Loretta ran the meter and Philip took his measurements. And once we'd opened it up, the smell came out. I don't have a good way to describe that smell except to say it was wrong. It was dry. That surprised me, because old mines usually smell like water and rust. This was more like something dead a long time ago in a closed room, and under that there was a sharp ammonia bite, the kind a den has, and under that, faint, something like singed hair. Loretta stepped back from the mouth and would not go near it again. Doreen got the headlamp and shined it into the gap, and about 15 feet back, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, and in that chamber, hanging from a timber, there was a mule deer. Or what was left of one. It had been dragged in there and wedged up off the floor, and it had been there a while. Nobody hangs a deer 15 feet inside a caved uranium prospect. No animal we knew of did that either. That was the point I stopped being able to tell myself it was a prank. You do not fake the inside of a sealed mine. I told everybody we were done. We'd flag the opening as it stood, write it up, and leave at first light. Philip wanted to go in and look at the chamber. I told him no. The air in there could be bad, which was true. Old adits hold gas. But that was not really why I said it. I just did not want any of us in that hole. He grumbled, but he didn't argue, and we strung flagging across the mouth and went back to the container as the light went orange and long, and I remember thinking we'd be fine. We just had to get through one night. That first night was when it really started. We slept in and around the container. Loretta and Doreen had cots inside. Philip had a tent, and I'd been sleeping in the bed of the truck because I liked the air. Sometime in the dark, I don't know what hour, I woke up because the coyotes had stopped. There's always coyotes out there. You hear them all night, that high yipping off in the washes, and at some point I realized I'd been lying awake in total silence and had no idea how long. Then I heard it. Off past the generator, maybe 40 yards out toward the cliff. A yip, like a coyote starting up. But it climbed wrong, up into something that cracked and broke in the middle, and for about 2 seconds it sounded like it was trying to make a word, and then it cut off clean. Like something had decided not to finish. I sat up in the truck bed, real slow. The wind had come up a little, and the moon was about half, enough to see the shape of the land and not much else. I looked out toward the cliff, and I couldn't see anything. And then the generator, which had been running all night to keep the meter charged, sputtered and quit. I found out the next morning that it had been switched off, not run dry. The kill switch was thrown. Something had walked into the middle of our camp, reached down past a hot exhaust, and turned it off, and I never heard a footstep. I woke the others, quietly. I'm not going to lie to you. My hands were shaking when I climbed down out of that truck, and I had to grip the tailgate for a second to get steady. We got everybody into the container, and I pulled the door most of the way shut, and the 4 of us sat in the dark and listened. For a long time, there was nothing. Then there was a sound on the metal roof. Not a thump. A slow pressure, like weight being set down and shifted, the way you test ice before you put your boot on it. It crossed the roof from one end to the other, real slow, and stopped right over the door. And then a voice. I want to be careful how I say this, because it's the part nobody believes. It was not a perfect voice. It was rough, and it broke. And it was working too hard, like an engine that won't catch. But it called out, and what it called was close enough to Doreen's name that she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark. We had used her name out loud all day, calling coordinates, calling her over to the adit. The figure on the roof had been listening to us, and now it was trying us out, one at a time, to see who would answer. Nobody answered. That was the first thing my grandfather ever taught me about this, and it was the only thing I got right that whole first night. You do not answer it. You do not say one word back. We sat in that dark metal box, and not one of us made a sound. After a while, I don't know how long, the weight came off the roof. The camp went quiet, and it stayed quiet until the sky started to gray out. In the morning, we tried to leave. I want to walk you through this part carefully, because this is where I made my mistakes and where you start to understand how bad it got. The plan was simple. Load the meter and the cooler, leave the rest, drive out, send the closure crew back later with more people. We came out of the container into a wind that had picked up overnight and was now blowing steady out of the southwest, the kind of dry spring wind that puts a haze of red dust over everything and gets in your teeth. I went to the truck first. The 2 tires on the driver's side were flat. Not slashed, I checked. The valve stems had been pulled out, which is a thing a person does, and which made it so much worse because now I couldn't even tell myself an animal had done it. We had one spare. I started changing the front one, and Doreen called out from the container that the radio was gone. We had a handheld radio we used to reach the truck, and on a good day, to bounce a signal off a repeater up on the mountain. It had been sitting on the shelf inside the container all night with the four of us 4 feet away, and now it was gone. The satellite phone was still in the cab, and I want to flag that for you because it matters later. But the satellite phone needs a clear view of the sky to lock onto anything. The dust had come up so thick by then that I could not get it to find a signal. I tried for what felt like 20 minutes. All I got was a screen that kept searching and searching. So that's where we stood by the middle of the day. One truck on 2 flat tires with one spare. No radio. A satellite phone that couldn't see the sky through the dust. 30 miles of washboard to the nearest pavement, and a good 60 to anybody who could actually help us. And the thing was working us in the daylight now, because while I was wrestling with that second flat, Doreen, who had walked up the draw to refill water jugs at the cache we'd left, started screaming. I came up out of that draw faster than I have ever moved in my life, and what I saw I'm going to tell you exactly the way it happened, because the shape of it scared me worse than the teeth did. There was a figure standing between Doreen and the camp. It was maybe 80 yards from me, up on 2 legs, and it was tall, taller than a person, with the shoulders bunched up high and wrong. It was covered in a hide. That's the only word I have for it. A dog skin, or a coyote skin, or several of them pieced together and pulled over a body that was the wrong shape for it. The hide hung loose in some places and stretched tight in others. The dust had worked into it until it was the same dirty straw color as the badland behind it. I couldn't see a face. I could see the muzzle, the long dog muzzle, but the way it sat on the front of the head was wrong, like it had been put on rather than grown. It was watching Doreen. She had backed up against the cliff with the water jug still in her hands, frozen, and I understood right then that it had cut her off from the camp on purpose, the way you'd separate one animal from a herd. I did the only thing I could think of. I did not yell its name, because I did not have a name for it, and would not have used one if I did. I grabbed a rock and a tire iron off the ground, and I beat the iron against the truck's flat steel wheel as hard and as fast as I could. I screamed at Doreen to run to me. Just run. I kept banging that iron, and the noise rolled out across the open ground. The figure turned its head toward me. Slow. And I watched the silver in its eyes. They caught the light flat and pale like 2 coins, and they were set too far forward in the head and too close together, more like a person's eyes than a dog's. It looked at me for a 2 count. Then it dropped. It dropped onto all 4 legs, all at once, and it was a different thing on the ground than it had been standing up. Lower. Faster. It came across that open flat at Doreen in a dead run, and she was already moving, and the only reason she made it is that the cliff funneled her right past me, and I got between them with the tire iron up. I will tell you that I have never swung anything that hard. I caught it across the side of the head as it came in, a full swing with both arms, and it was like hitting a fence post wrapped in a wet blanket. It rocked sideways. It made a sound, low, a cough that turned into a click deep in its chest. It went around me low and fast, and was into the brush and up the slump of rock at the head of the draw before I could swing a second time. It did not vanish. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard people tell these stories and have the thing just disappear. It did not disappear. It ran up over the rock the way anything would, and it was gone behind the cliff, and I heard it knock rock loose going up. It left, the way a real thing leaves. Doreen had a long scrape down her forearm from the cliff, and she was shaking, but she was whole. Loretta had come running with the deer rifle we kept in the truck for snakes and feral dogs. She'd gotten 2 shots off at it as it ran, and one of them connected, because there was blood on the rock at the head of the draw. Dark, and a lot of it. So I knew 2 things after that. I knew it could be hurt, because it bled. And I knew the rifle hadn't been near enough because it bled, and it kept right on going. We got back to the container and barred the door, and I made everybody sit and breathe for a minute. And this is where I have to tell you about the copying, because I think it's the part that has stayed with me longer than anything, longer than the teeth, longer than what happened to Philip. While we were gone up the draw, something had been at our camp. Our survey flags, the pin flags we used to mark openings, had been pulled up and set back down in a circle around the container, every one of them leaning in toward us. And the rock stack. There was a new cairn by the container door, 3 or 4 stones balanced careful, the same way we built ours, the same way it had topped off ours, and balanced on the very top stone was the antenna off our missing radio. It had carried that radio off in the night and brought us back a piece of it and set it on a little tower it built to match the ones we built. I don't have an explanation for that. I've never had one. It was doing what we did. It had been watching us do our work for 3 days, and it was doing it back at us. And I have never in my life felt so much like prey, because prey is not something you mimic. Prey is something you study. Loretta was the calmest of us, and that's when she told me the rest of what her grandmother had said about this drainage. She said the old people believed there were ones who put on the skin of an animal so they could move like it and hunt like it. She said they used to be people once, and that the worst of them lost the line between the skin and themselves. She said you don't fight a thing like that the way you fight an animal, because it isn't only an animal. And you don't reason with it the way you'd reason with a person, because whatever it used to be, it isn't that anymore. She said the old way was fire and ash. She said her grandmother's brothers, the ones who knew the songs, used to deal with a place like that with fire. She said whatever was out there had a den, and the den was that at it, and the deer hanging in there was its larder. We had cracked it open like a fool and let the dust out. Philip was sitting against the wall, holding a rag to his face from where dust and grit had gotten into his eyes. He said, real quiet, that there was no way that thing carried off a 5-pound radio and balanced an antenna on a rock. He said a person was doing this. He said somebody was out there messing with us, and we needed to get to the truck. And I understood why he needed to believe that. A person you can fight. A person you can report. I let him believe it because we did need to get to the truck, and it didn't matter to me right then what he called the thing that was going to come for us when the light went. Because the light was going. That's the part I want you to feel. We had burned the whole day on flat tires and a dead radio and a phone that couldn't see the sky, and now the sun was getting low and red behind all that blowing dust, and we were not getting out before dark. The second flat would not take the spare. The stem was gone on it too. I had a 12-volt pump, but the bead would not seat and hold against a pulled stem. I tried. I burned an hour on it with the light dying, and it just sat there flat. So I made the call that we were not going to die trying to walk 30 miles in the dark with that thing loose. We were going to ford up in the container, keep the deer rifle and the fire stuff close, and hold through the night. At first light, when the dust laid down and the phone could see the sky, we would get a call out and limp the truck on the rim if we had to. I want to tell you about the fire stuff, because it's the thing that saved us, and because I'd be a liar if I made it sound like a plan. It wasn't a plan yet. We had 2 jerry cans of gasoline for the generator. We had a fistful of road flares in the truck cab, the kind you light off and it burns hot and red and won't blow out easy. And we had Loretta's grandmother's words sitting in my head, fire and ash, the old way. I moved the gas cans and the flares into the container with us. I didn't have it worked out. I just knew that if Loretta was right, and if the rifle wasn't enough, and the rifle wasn't, then the only card I had left was the one my own grandfather and her grandmother had handed down. I was not too proud or too educated to play it. The wind died down right after full dark, and that was the worst thing that could have happened, because the wind had been the only thing covering its sound. When the wind dropped, the quiet came back, the same dead quiet from the first night, and the 4 of us sat in that steel box in the dark and waited for it. It came back a little while later. We heard it on the gravel first, the soft crunch of it walking the camp, slow, working the perimeter the way it had every night. Then the pressure on the roof. Then it came down off the roof and started on the door. And this was different from the first night. The first night it had only tested us. This time it meant to get in. It started with the door seam. There was a gap of maybe a quarter inch where the steel door met the frame, and I heard claws work into that gap, and then I felt the whole door flex inward against the bar as it pulled. The bar held. I had braced it with a length of drill steel jammed against the far wall, and it held. But the door bowed and shrieked on its hinges, and the gap at the top widened. And I saw, in the dark, one long finger come through the gap. Not a claw. A finger with a claw on the end of it. And it was too long, and it hooked over the top edge of the door and pulled, and the metal screamed. I drove the tire iron down on it as hard as I could, and it pulled back and the door slammed shut and held. And then it went still, and we sat there breathing, and I thought, stupidly, that maybe that was the worst of it. There was a vent on the side of the container, just a louvered steel vent, a foot square, up near the roof, the kind they put in so the box doesn't cook in the sun. I had not thought about it because it was too small for anything to come through, and it was too small. That was the problem. It was too small for it to come through, so instead it reached through. I heard the louvers tear loose, that flat tin shriek, and then there was an arm in the box with us, in the dark, sweeping. Philip was closest to that wall. He'd grabbed a pry bar and gone to jam it up against the vent to block it, which was the brave thing and the wrong thing, and the arm came through and got him. I'm going to tell you what happened to Philip the way I'd tell it to an investigator, plainly, because that's the only way I can stand to tell it at all. The hand closed on his right forearm, just below the elbow, and it had the strength of something that outweighed a grown person, and it pulled. It pulled his arm out through that 1-foot vent up to the shoulder. The edges of the torn steel and the force of the pull did most of the damage, that and the teeth, because it had its mouth at the vent on the other side. By the time Loretta and I got our hands on him and hauled back, the skin and most of the muscle had been stripped off the back of his forearm from the elbow down. 2 of his fingers were gone. The bone was showing white and broken in the headlamp light, and he was screaming in a way I will hear for the rest of my life. We pulled him back into the box. We had to pull hard, and I know that hurt him worse, but the alternative was it taking him out through the wall a piece at a time. I got a strap around his upper arm and cinched it down to slow the bleeding. Doreen got her whole weight on the wound with a wadded shirt. Loretta picked up the deer rifle and put a round through that torn-open vent into the dark, and the arm came out of the box. We heard it go off the wall and onto the gravel. While I was pulling Philip back, it had gotten me too. I want to be honest about that, because it's the only reason the rest of the night went the way it did. When I reached down for Philip's belt, my back was to the vent for a second. The claws on that hand raked down across my left shoulder blade, and the meat of my back as it swept past, 4 deep lines. The corner of the torn steel caught me across the scalp above my left ear and opened it up. It was not what happened to Philip. I want to be clear. It was 4 cuts and a split scalp, and I could still move, and Philip could not, and that difference is the only reason I'm the one telling this. But I bled down the back of my shirt the rest of the night. My left arm did not want to lift right after that. The blood kept running into my left eye from the scalp cut, and I had to keep wiping it on my shoulder. I want you to keep that in mind, because I was the one who had to do what came next, and I was doing it with one good arm and blood in my eye. Here is what I understood, sitting on the floor of that box with my hand on Philip's tourniquet and my back on fire. The door would not hold all night. The vent was open now. It had our blood, and it had Philip's blood, and it was not going to leave. We could not drive out. We could not call out until the dust laid down at first light, and first light was hours away, and Philip did not have hours. Not with that arm. So I made the decision, and I made it out loud, and I made it the way my grandfather would have wanted, which is that I did not argue with what the thing was. I just decided to do the old thing to it. I told Loretta and Doreen the plan. The den, the adit, was 200 yards up the draw. It would have to come at us across the open flat between the container and the cliff to get to us, and there was only the one good line across that flat, the slick rock bench, because everything else was cut up with little washes. So I was going to give it a reason to take that line. I was going to put the gas on the bench, and I was going to be on the far side of it with a flare. The reason I was going to give it was me. The container had the one set of doors, and the thing was working them every few minutes and then circling off into the dark to come at us again. So we waited for it to break off and move back out toward the cliff, and the second it did, I went out those doors with a jerry can in my good hand. I went fast and low, out onto the slick rock bench, and I dumped that whole can in a line across it, upwind, so the fumes would carry back toward the cliff. I dumped the second can in a puddle at the near edge, where the bench met the open flat. Then I got to the far side of it, between the gas and the truck, between the thing and the rest of my crew, and I made noise. I banged the empty can. I yelled, not words, just noise, and I let it see me. And while it was fixed on me, Doreen and Loretta got Philip up out of the container and the other way, low and quiet, toward the truck. It came back around for the camp the way it had all night, and this time I was out there in the open in front of it. It saw me. It dropped to all fours and ran the bench, exactly like I needed it to. The bench was the only clean ground, and a thing built to run takes the clean ground. It came across that slick rock in the dark faster than I could believe. I will tell you, my whole body wanted to turn and run, and I did not let it. I waited until it was on the wet rock, until it was right in the middle of the gas, close enough that I could smell the carrion and the ammonia coming off it. Then I struck the flare on the cap and threw it underhand into the puddle at the near edge. The wind was dead, which I'd been afraid of all night, and which turned out to be the only mercy I got, because dead air meant the fumes had pooled low over the rock instead of blowing away. It went up all at once. Not like in the movies, no fireball, just a low sheet of fire that ran the length of that gas line in under a second and stood up off the slick rock 4 feet high, and the thing was in the middle of it. The hide caught first. That dry, dusty, pieced-together hide caught like dead brush, and it went up screaming, and I want to tell you the screaming changed. It started like an animal and it ended like something else, and I am not going to describe the something else because I promised myself I never would. It came off the bench on fire, and it ran. A thing on fire does not run away from light. It runs toward the dark hole it knows, and the dark hole it knew was the adit, the den, 200 yards up the draw. It ran for it burning, and it went into its own den, and it did not come back out. I did not chase it. I want to be clear that I did not go in after it like a fool. I went back to my crew. Doreen had Philip in the bed of the truck with the tourniquet holding, her whole body holding him down so he wouldn't thrash. Loretta was with them, the rifle pointed up the draw at the mouth of the burning den. The 4 of us sat there in the dark and the firelight and watched that adit burn from the inside, smoke rolling out of every crack in the cliff above it. Nothing came out. We sat like that until the sky went gray. The dust had laid down by then. I got the satellite phone up out of the cab and pointed it at the open sky, and it found a signal in under a minute. I called it in to the tribal police dispatch. I told them we had someone badly hurt and we needed a helicopter, and I gave them our coordinates off the meter. They got a bird to us a couple hours after sunup. I'm not going to walk you through all of that. Philip lived. They flew him to the regional hospital and then to a bigger one, and he kept the arm in the sense that it's still attached, but he never got the use of it back, and he lost the 2 fingers for good. Before the helicopter came, when it was full light and the smoke had thinned, I walked up the draw to the adit. I told Loretta not to come, and she came anyway with the rifle. I needed to see it. I needed to know it was a real thing that had really died, and not something I'd have to wonder about for the rest of my life. The flagging we'd strung across the mouth 2 days before was burned away. The brush was burned. And just inside the mouth, in the ash, there was a body. It was burned down to almost nothing, curled up the way things curl in a fire, and the hide had burned off it. And what was under the hide was the part I have never told anybody until now. It was not a coyote, it was not a dog. Under where the hide had been, there was a frame that was long and thin and gone black. One of the arms had fallen away from the body into the cooler ash at the edge. That arm had a hand on the end of it. The hand had 5 fingers, and they were a person's fingers. Around what was left of the wrist, there was a band of melted silver and turquoise, the kind of bracelet an old-timer out here might have worn 50 years ago, fused into the bone by the heat. I stood there and I looked at that for a long time. Loretta put her hand on my good shoulder and said we should not be looking at it, and she was right. We covered it with our jackets and went back down to the truck. Neither of us has said one word about that hand to anybody since, until I just said it to you. The tribal police came out later with the closure crew, and they logged what was in that adit as unidentified human remains, decades old, and a backfill went over the whole opening that fall, the way it should have years before. The 2 prospectors from the uranium days were never found. Neither was the one who came looking for them 30 years after. I am not going to stand here and tell you which one was in that hole, or whether it was any of them, or what it had been before it put on the skin. I don't know. My grandfather raised me to know the difference between what I saw and what I want to be true. The dust laid down a little more after sunup. The phone kept its signal, and the helicopter came, and that was that. Philip still tells anyone who asks that it was a bear. He says it with the one good hand he is left to point with, and I never argue with him. It's easier to live next to a bear. In 2022, in the high spruce fir country on the Tennessee side of the Great Smoky Mountains, a 56-year-old backcountry trail supervisor watched a 71-year-old retired ranger volunteer walk 20 yards to a privy and never come back, and recovered his body at first light from a Fraser fir 20 feet off the ground, with a broken neck and 4 puncture wounds clean through the upper chest. The supervisor and his search and rescue coordinator heard one long, thin whistle from somewhere up in the canopy, then a wet sound from the privy door, and they were on the path inside 2 minutes. He was already gone. Whatever killed him went straight up the trunk of a Fraser fir and never came back down where anybody could see it. By the time the deputy and the rest of the ground team reached the shelter, a seasonal trail technician had been lifted out by helicopter with claw lacerations across his scalp and shoulders. A male section hiker had been recovered dead from a side trail with a crushed thorax. A female section hiker's pack was still hanging in low Fraser fir branches about 90 yards from the shelter. The woman herself was never found. The supervisor never raised the carbine he carried. He chose to photograph what little he could and to walk the rest of his crew off the mountain alive. Old people in Cocke County, the ones who still remembered the high spruce logging camps, had a name for the kind of thing that does this. They called it the high whistler. If you have ever heard a sound come out of a tree late at night that no bird and no cat makes, you understand why the supervisor made the call he made. What follows is his account. Before this story begins, if you're into chilling horror, take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good scare. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop it in the comments. Thank you for the support, it really does mean a lot. All right, let's get into it. My name is Briggs Galloway, and what I'm about to tell you happened in July of 2022, up at the Tri-Corner Knob Shelter on the Tennessee side of the Great Smokies. I had been a backcountry trail supervisor on the Cosby side of the park for 23 years by then, working out of the little ranger station off the road. Up at Tri-Corner Knob that July, with a crew of 4, the reason we were up there was a June storm. The storm had taken the privy roof off, popped the chimney stones out of the shelter fireplace, and put a quarter-mile of switchback under a deadfall jackpot you could not have walked a horse through. We had a permit and a 5-day window. The other thing I had, sitting in the pocket of my rain jacket when I locked up the truck on the way in, was a slip of paper from dispatch with 2 names on it. The slip was a courtesy. A pair of section hikers were 2 days overdue from a permit that put them at Tri-Corner Knob on Sunday. Husband and wife, mid-30s, hiking south. Dispatch was not sounding alarms because section hikers run late in July. They asked me to keep an eye out. I told them I would. In 23 years on the Cosby side, I had not once had a section hiker turn up dead on me. We found the shoe that evening. Pierce Tisdale, our seasonal trail technician, found it first. Pierce was 24, second season on the crew. He had been scouting the side trail to the Eagle Rocks overlook, which dead ends at a bluff and is not on any permit, when he came back up the slab carrying a shoe. He turned it over so I could see the inside of the tongue. There was a long, even smear of blood across the foam, dried dark. There was a single broken-off piece of toenail in the laces. It was a left-foot mid-cut hiking shoe, women's size 8. The female name on my dispatch slip went with that shoe. I had Pierce mark the spot with flagging tape and started back to the shelter to get on the sat phone. That is where the trip stopped being a trail rehab job and became what it became. By the time I got back to the shelter, the rest of the crew was setting up for the evening. Holden Maddox, my trail foreman, was fitting plywood patches over the privy roof opening. Holden was 47, 18 years on the park. The most procedural human being I have ever worked with. He looked at the photo of the shoe on my phone, walked to the topo map taped to the inside of the shelter, and traced the side trail with his finger. He said the trail dead ends at the Eagle Rocks Bluff, and nobody hikes it in summer. I told him I knew. He nodded and went back to the roof. Renata Vickers was the next person I told. She went by Rennie. She was 33, a bat biologist on detail from the regional office. She had hitched onto our trip because the high-elevation spruce fir at Tri-Corner Knob is one of the only places in the southern Appalachians where she can record a couple of species that are not doing well. Rennie had her acoustic detector on a carbon fiber pole next to the shelter, pointed up at the canopy, headphones on. When I told her about the shoe, she pulled one ear off and looked at me, and the first thing she said was, "I have been here 20 minutes, and I have not had a single pass." I did not understand at the time what she meant. She told me her detector should already have been clicking like a Geiger counter near a hot rock at that elevation, that early in the evening. It was not clicking at all. The bats were not flying. The trees were empty. Looking back, that was the first signal I missed. I walked off to find Coyne. Cyprian Reese, who had gone by Coyne since he was a boy, was the 5th person on the trip. He was 71. He had retired off the park in 2018 after 32 years as a backcountry ranger, and he came along as a volunteer because he could not stay out of the Upper Smokies. Coyne was the kind of man who arrived at a shelter and checked the bear cables, the privy seat, the spring pipe, and the fire ring before he set his pack down. He had done all of that by the time I came up the trail with the photo of the shoe. He looked at it for a long count and handed the phone back. He said, "Briggs, that shoe did not walk to that slab on its own." I got on the sat phone at the edge of the clearing, where I could get a clean shot of the sky. I raised dispatch, reported a probable victim sign on the side trail, described the shoe, and read off the names. Dispatch came back, told me they were elevating the case to a full search and rescue response, and that they were mobilizing Dasha Linville, our SAR coordinator, on the first weather window. Dasha would helo into the Mount Sequoia landing zone the next day. Dispatch also told me the Cocke County Sheriff's Office was sending a deputy and a small ground team up the Big Creek Road as a parallel response. The deputy's name was Wyatt Sampson. I locked the call and walked back to the shelter. We ate that evening out of foil pouches at the picnic table inside the shelter, with the door open so we could see the privy path. Coyne said it twice. He had been on this stretch of trail more than 100 times in 30 years, and he had never seen a shoe like that, with that much dried blood on it, away from a road, on a bluff trail that no section hiker has business turning down. He thought the woman had been moved. He did not say what had moved her. Holden said he wanted a watch overnight. Coyne volunteered first. I took second. Pierce wanted in on the rotation. I told him no. I needed him fresh for the morning sweep. He was a little hurt by that. He crawled into his sleeping bag with his headphones in, listening to nothing because we had no signal. I sat on the picnic bench under the lantern with my carbine across my lap for the second watch. The wind in the spruce fir at 5,800 feet sounds like a long hiss with a click at the bottom of it. I could hear a barred owl about a half-mile down toward Hughes Ridge. I did not hear any small things. No deer mice in the duff. No bats. Rennie had been right. I let the watch run. Holden and I left the shelter at first light with sat phone, radios, flagging tape, a camera, water, and a small first aid kit. We left Coyne, Rennie, and Pierce at the shelter with instructions not to leave the clearing. The clearing at Tri-Corner Knob is small. You can see the privy from the porch and the spring from the privy. It is the kind of place where, if you stay in the clearing, you are not really alone. We walked the side trail back out to the granite slab where the shoe had been. The shoe was still there. The blood on the tongue had not changed. Holden took photographs with my phone while I scanned the duff for sign. About 40 yards past the slab, on a downhill stretch where the trail narrows between two red spruce, I found a place where the duff had been scraped sideways. There was a single track set deep in the wet leaf litter, 3 toes, about 9 inches long, heavy. The rear of the print was almost square. There was no claw mark in the duff in front of the toes, which meant whatever made the print had pulled its claws in like a cat does. I had walked tracks in these mountains for 23 years, and I had never seen this print. Holden looked at it for a long count and said, "That is not a bear." That was all he said. We followed the scrape line another 40 yards into the spruce. About 80 yards off the side trail, in a thicket where the canopy comes down low because of an old wind throw, we found him. The male section hiker was on his back at the base of a big red spruce, set into the low branches, as if somebody had pushed him up into them and let go. His chest was crushed over the sternum broken, at least 4 ribs on each side broken in a single event. There were 4 puncture wounds through the upper chest, evenly spaced, that had bled out into his shirt and dried hard. His throat was not torn. His face was not damaged. His pack was about 10 feet from him, still latched. We did not see the woman. Holden held a hand up and just stood there. After a count, he said the word, "Okay," like he was checking that the word still worked. I photographed everything, flagged the perimeter, and walked back to the shelter to get on the sat phone. I left Holden with the body. That was the procedure. I think about that part a lot, that we did the procedural thing and left him with a body in the spruce with a print like that 30 yards away. I should tell you about Dasha Linville because you need to know who she is. She had been our search and rescue coordinator for 12 years by the summer of 2022. She was 41. Before the park, she had run mountain rescue in the Tetons. Before that, she had been an Army medic. When you tell Dasha by radio that you have a crushed thorax in the spruce fir at 5,800 feet, she does not ask you to repeat yourself. She tells you what time she will be there. The helicopter dropped her on the LZ later that morning, and I walked her in. On the way to the body, she asked me 3 questions. Was there any sign of a struggle on the trail? Was the chest wound consistent with a fall? Had I seen the woman? I answered no, no, and no. She did not ask anything else until we were standing over the body. Then she crouched down for a long count. She looked at the puncture spacing. She looked at the way the body was set into the low branches. She looked at the tracks in the duff. She said, "Briggs, this body did not get here by falling." I told her I knew. She walked back to the print, took her own photographs, and said, "I'm going to tell dispatch we have a predator event and ask for a ground team and full lift capability." I said yes. On the walk back from the body, Dasha stopped maybe 90 yards short of the shelter and pointed up into a stand of low Fraser fir. There was a backpack set into the branches about 18 feet off the ground. The straps were intact. It looked like it had been placed there. It was the woman's. We did not climb after it. We flagged the trunk and walked on. We got back to the shelter, and Dasha got on the sat phone. The agency woke up. By the time she was off the phone, a state wildlife biologist and Wyatt Sampson's ground team were on the road. Dasha set up her own kit at the shelter. Pierce had been hauling deadfall off the lower switchback all morning and looked at me like he was waiting for me to send him home. I told him to keep working in the clearing only, in sight of the shelter. He nodded. He did not look afraid. That was the problem. We worked through the afternoon. Holden and Coyne fixed the rest of the privy roof and started on the chimney stones. I helped Pierce with the deadfall, but only as far as the first big yellow birch below the shelter, where we could still see the door. Rennie set up at the south edge of the clearing with her detector pointed at the canopy. She did not log a single bat pass all afternoon. Pierce told me he had been thinking about the whistle his cousin had claimed to have heard on a hunt up here years ago. I told him I did not want to hear about it. He laughed. He was a good kid. Later in the day, Rennie pulled the headphones off and walked straight to me with the detector still on her shoulder. She said, "Briggs, I just got a pass at 20 kilohertz, and it is not a bat." She played it on the speaker. It was a long descending whistle with a fluttery break in the middle. It lasted almost 4 seconds. It was coming from up the ridge toward Mount Sequoia. She played it again. The third time she played it, Coyne stood up from the chimney stones, walked over, and listened. He said, "I have heard that twice in my life. Both times I was up here." He looked at me, and I will tell you he looked older when he said it. I went and got Dasha. Dasha and Rennie and I walked about 200 yards up the AT toward Sequoia and stood there in the spruce. The whistle came again a while later. I heard it that time without the detector. It was up high, in the canopy, and it carried over a long distance. There is no bird call in these mountains that sounds like that. There is no cat call. It was not a fox. The closest thing it sounded like was a man trying to whistle through a piece of tubing he was breathing through at the same time. We could not locate the source. The wind was wrong. I told Dasha we were going to button up the shelter, keep everybody inside the clearing, and wait for the morning ground team. The whistle did not come again that I could hear, although Rennie said the detector caught one more later that evening at the same frequency. I am getting ahead of myself, though, because I want to back up to Pierce. Because Pierce is where this got bad. Pierce was bored. That is a hard thing to say about somebody who got hurt as bad as he did, but it is true. He had been hauling deadfall all afternoon, then we had pulled him off it, and he had been sitting at the picnic table with his phone, scrolling nothing because there was no signal, listening to me and Dasha and Coyne talk about the whistle. After Rennie logged that second pass and I walked the perimeter, I went back into the shelter to update the topo map. When I came out, Pierce was not at the picnic table. His pack was, his phone was, his hand axe was not. I called for him. There was no answer. Holden came around the side of the shelter and said he had seen Pierce walking up the trail towards Sequoia a while earlier, and he had assumed Pierce was going with Dasha because Dasha had been talking about going back up that direction. Dasha was inside the shelter. She had not gone anywhere. Dasha and I went up the AT after him. The light was already going. The spruce fir at that elevation gets dark before you think it should. We found him 200 yards north of the shelter, at the edge of a stand of mature Fraser fir where the trail bends around a slab. He was standing under one of the big firs, head tilted back, looking up. The hand axe was in his right hand at his side. He did not know we were there. I called his name once, quietly. He turned his head a little and started to answer me, and that was when it came down. I want to tell you I saw it clearly. I did not. What I saw was a long shape coming down the trunk of the fir on the far side from us, head first, in a motion that did not look like anything I had ever seen on a tree. It moved like a long cat, maybe 6 feet from nose to tail. the color of dead lichen on a fallen spruce log, mottled gray and green and black, with a wet look to it. Its eyes were forward set, pale, with a yellow shine when it caught my headlamp on the way around. It hit Pierce from behind on his right shoulder and put him face down in the duff in less than a second. Then it was on his back. Then it was inside the fur. Then it was up the trunk. Dasha got there first. She had her sidearm out and she did not fire. There was no clear shot. Pierce was face down on the ground and the climber was already going. She told me later that she had a moment of clear vision through the branches when it was 12 feet up the trunk, and she still did not fire, because a wounded climber at that range, dropping back down, would have been on us before we could move. I do not blame her. She made the right call. We got Pierce flipped over. His scalp was opened in 4 parallel lines from his hairline back to the crown, deep, bleeding hard. His shoulders had matching sets of 4 parallel lines through the shirt and into the muscle. The puncture pattern matched the punctures on the male hiker's chest. Same spacing, same depth. Dasha had a pressure bandage on him inside a minute. I called the shelter on the radio, and Coyne and Holden came up with a litter from the cache. We carried Pierce back. He was conscious. He said one thing on the carry that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "I heard the bird call again right before it dropped. It was right above me." He smiled a little, like he had finally figured something out. The smile was the worst part. We got him to the shelter. Coyne went over him head to toe. He had kept his EMT credentials current since the late 1990s. He sutured the worst of the scalp lacerations and packed the rest. Dasha started a saline line. Rennie got on the sat phone and confirmed the medevac for the next morning. The pilot had a hard cloud ceiling, so we did not have a window before then. The whistle came twice more during the night, once from up the slope behind the shelter, once from down toward Hughes Ridge. Rennie's detector caught a third pass that none of us heard with our own ears, sometime in the middle of the night from due east. I want to skip ahead, because you need to know how Wyatt Sampson got there before I tell you about Coyne. Wyatt was the Cocke County Sheriff's deputy on ground SR. He was 38. Once dispatch heard about Pierce, he and 4 members of his team started up Snake Den Ridge on foot in the dark, with night-capable headlamps, and made the shelter later that evening. He took a brief from me and Dasha at the picnic table, and asked one question. He said, "What do you want from us tonight?" I told him to set the perimeter. He set the perimeter. Coyne was the steadiest one of us all day. After he sutured Pierce and Pierce was sleeping against the shelter wall with a saline line in him, Coyne sat on the bench, ate cold food out of a foil pouch, and watched the privy path with the lantern off. Late on, he stood up and said he wanted to walk to the privy before he turned in. I offered to walk over with him. He looked at me and said, "Briggs, I have been using this privy since 1986. The walk is 20 yards. Sit your watch." I told him to take a radio. He took a radio, clipped a small red headlamp to his cap, and walked out. I watched the headlamp move along the path. The path goes east, northeast, out of the clearing for about 20 yards before it bends behind a fold of spruce trunks and into a little screened opening where the privy sits. The lamp went behind the trunks. I did not see it disappear. It just was not visible anymore, the way a light is not visible when it goes around a corner. I waited a count. I waited a longer count. The radio did not click. Then Dasha and I heard one long, thin whistle from somewhere up in the canopy over the privy path. The whistle dropped a full octave at the end of it. It was the only one we heard the whole trip that started high and finished low. A breath after it, we heard a wet sound, like a heavy palm slapping a wet board. We were off the bench before I registered the sound. We were on the path. Wyatt came around the corner of the shelter behind us with the long gun up. The privy door was open. The latch was hanging on one screw. Coyne was not inside. There was blood on the inside of the door handle, a thumb's worth, smeared. The door frame had 4 parallel scratches on the inside, head high. deeper than a man's nails could make. There was a long, dragged smear in the duff outside the privy door, leading east toward the spruce, and it stopped at the base of a fir. There was a single boot scuff in the moss next to the trunk. The whistle moved up in the canopy somewhere above us. There were no eyes I could find with the headlamp, no shape in the branches, nothing. The wind in the spruce sounded like it always sounds. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have been over this 1,000 times and I do not want to make it sound like I knew. I did not. I told Wyatt and Dasha we were retreating to the shelter. I told Rennie to lock the door, Holden to bring Pierce inside and put him against the back wall, the 2 members of Wyatt's team to stay in the doorway with the lantern off and a long gun forward. I had Wyatt and Dasha on the porch with me. We did not go up after Coin. We did not break the perimeter. We did not fire. We listened to the whistle move 3 times around the clearing. Each time it was up in the canopy. Each time it was somewhere we could not see and could not have shot at if we wanted to. Sometime after that, I made the call on the sat phone and asked for a wider helo response at first light. Pierce was sleeping. Rennie held his hand once and let it go. I sat on the porch through the rest of the night with Wyatt across from me. Dasha came out and sat with us for a stretch in the middle. Nobody said much. At one point, Wyatt said, "I am going to tell you something that will bother you in the morning, and I am telling you for a reason." I told him to go ahead. He said, "I think he was dead at the door." I told him I had thought the same thing. Wyatt nodded. He said, "Then we are not retrieving him from a tree alive in the morning, and you can stop carrying that." I appreciated it. I did not stop carrying it. I told myself for a long stretch of that night that Coin was up a tree somewhere, alive, hurt, but alive, and that we were going to find him at first light. I knew also that we were not. Both things were true at the same time in my head. First light came in slow. The spruce fir holds night under the canopy longer than you expect. When there was enough light at ground level to move, we went out as a unit. Wyatt and one of his SAR team members with long guns up. Dasha and the other team member with the litter. Holden behind us with the camera. Rennie stayed in the shelter with Pierce. We followed the drag line east into the spruce. The line stopped at the base of the same Fraser fir where the boot scuff was. We stood there for a count, scanning the trunks. Wyatt spotted him. He just said, "He is up." He pointed about 20 feet up. Coin was set into a fork in the fir where 2 branches came off the trunk at a near right angle. He was face down across the fork, with one arm hanging. His head was at an angle that told us, before we got hands on him, that his neck was broken. His back showed 4 puncture wounds in the upper chest, 3 on the left and 1 on the right, that had come up through and out the front of his rain jacket. His face was untouched. His glasses were still on. The position looked deliberate in the sense that he was set in the fork and not dropped. The fir trunk had 4 parallel claw marks at about 6 feet up, deep, fresh. There were no other marks. We lowered him. It took the 4 of us a good while with a rope, a body bag, and a basic mechanical advantage rig Holden had brought up. The body weighed what he had weighed in life. I had not understood until that moment why people who have lowered a body out of a tree mention how heavy the body felt. The body felt heavy. Coin was on the litter and the litter was on the ground a while after first light. The helo was inbound for Pierce. I made the call to load Coin on the same lift separately on the second run. Rennie had Pierce ready at the shelter on a backboard. He was conscious on saline, talking in short sentences. He did not know about Coin. I told him on the porch, and he closed his eyes and did not open them again until the helo crew was loading him. The helo took Pierce and came back later for Coin. The pilot was a man named Erskine I had worked with a few times. He did not say much. He shook my hand on the LZ and lifted out. After the helo was gone, I stood at the LZ with Wyatt and Dasha and made the call. We were going to walk every living person off the mountain that day. The trail crew rehab work was over. Wyatt's 2 SAR team members would walk with us as far as the Snake Den Ridge cutoff and drop down their own route from there. I radioed dispatch and recorded the decision in the log. Then I walked back to the shelter. Holden was already packing the crew's gear. Rennie was folding her detector down. I sat on the bench for about a minute, took my phone out, scrolled to the last 2 photographs I had taken, and looked at them. I did not show them to anyone. The first photograph was a single yellow eye, set far back in spruce branches, about 8 feet off the ground. I had taken it in the middle of the night, sitting on the porch, when a movement in the trees made me raise the phone. The eye was clear. The branches were clear. The body around the eye was not, because the body around the eye was the color of the branches. The eye had a yellow tapetum reflex from the camera light. I had not consciously aimed at the eye. I had just held the phone up, pressed the shutter, and lowered it. The phone had caught what my eye had not finished registering. The second photograph was a single 3-toed print in the soft duff at the base of the privy path, taken just after sunup. The print was 9 inches long. The toes were heavy. The back was almost square. The claws were withdrawn. I shut the phone off, put it in my pocket, and walked over to Holden and said it was time to pack out. We left the shelter mid-morning, 5 people on foot. We walked north on the AT for a half mile, then dropped down the Snake Den Ridge Trail toward the Cosby Road. The first whistle came in behind us a half hour off the shelter. The second came in on our right, parallel, up in the canopy. The third came from our left, the same parallel, also high. The whistles moved with us. Nobody said anything. Wyatt walked rear. Dasha walked point with Holden. I walked beside Rennie. Around 4,700 feet, where the spruce fir gave way to yellow birch and red maple, the whistles stopped. We did not hear them again the rest of the way out. We came off at the Cosby trailhead in the late part of the day. The county had brought sandwiches from a diner in town. We ate them. I'm going to skip the part where I wrote the incident report in dispatch that night, and the part where I went to Pierce's room at the regional hospital. Pierce kept his scalp. He did not keep his second season. He went home to North Carolina and, as far as I know, has not been back on a trail crew since. Coyne's wife of 46 years was kind to me at the service. That is the part you should know. A couple of weeks after we walked off the mountain, I got a phone call at the Cosby Ranger Station from a man named Ennis Yarbrough, who edited the weekly newspaper in Newport. He had been writing a small piece on the recovery and wanted to ask me a few questions on the record. I told him I could not comment officially. He said he understood and that he was not asking officially. He said he had a file in the basement of his office that he thought I should see. I told him I would come out the following Tuesday. The newspaper office sat on the second floor of a building on Main Street in Newport, Tennessee, above a hardware store with a green awning. Ennis was 74. He had inherited the paper from his father in 1989 and run it himself since. He poured me coffee in a chipped white mug and took me down the back stairs to the basement. The basement smelled the way basements in old downtown buildings smell, of mildew and of cigarettes nobody had smoked in 20 years. The bound issues were on metal shelving along 3 walls. Ennis pulled 4 volumes off the shelf and set them on a long folding table under a hanging bulb. The volumes covered 1973 through 1979. He had sticky tabs marking articles in each. The 1973 article reported a pair of dairy goats and a calf taken off a farm at the foot of Mount Camerer. The farmer described tracks in his cattle lot that were 3-toed, unlike any bear track he had ever seen. The article ran 3-column inches on page 4. The 1974 article was a longer piece on the front page below the fold. A bear hunter from over the line in Madison County, North Carolina, had been working a pack of blue ticks in the spruce fir north of Mount Sterling. He lost one of the dogs in the canopy. He found the dog the next day, hung up 12 feet off the ground in a Fraser fir, neck broken, 4 punctures through the upper chest. The hunter said he had heard a long, thin whistle from up in the trees the day before he lost the dog. The article quoted him on the record. The quote was, "Old loggers in this country call it the High Whistler. It rode that canopy over my brother and never put a foot down." The 1975 article was 3 paragraphs. A section hiker had gone missing on the AT north of Tri-Corner Knob. The article presumed a fall off the Eagle Rocks Bluff. The hiker's pack had been found in low Fraser fir branches about 100 yards off the trail. The 1976 article was an interview with 2 hunters whose grandfather had worked a spruce logging camp on the north side of Mount Sterling in the late 1920s. The grandfather had used the same name, High Whistler. The article included a blurry photograph, taken at the close of the day, of a long mottled shape in a fir tree at about 18 feet up. Ennis told me he had seen the original negative once, that it had been sharper, and that the original was no longer in the file. The 1977 article reported a calf taken from a Cocke County pasture. 3-toed track. The 1978 article reported 2 missing AT through hikers, husband and wife, mid-20s. Their packs had been recovered in a Fraser fir 18 feet off the ground, a half-mile north of Tri-Corner Knob Shelter. The bodies were never found. The 1979 article reported 8 days of livestock disappearances at 3 farms at the base of the spruce fir zone. The article quoted a local game warden as saying he had heard the whistle himself once during the response, up in the canopy at the close of the day, and that he had not gone back into that drainage at night for the rest of his career. 8 incidents in 7 years, in the same drainage and the same canopy. After 1979, the paper had nothing. Ennis said his father had stopped writing it up. His father had told him, the year he handed the paper over in 1989, that the file was in the basement, that he was to leave it there, and that he was to only show it to people who already knew. Ennis closed the bound volumes. He pulled a manila folder out of a drawer. It had photocopies of the articles, the 1976 photograph, and a typed page his father had handwritten and his mother had typed in 1979, listing all 8 incidents in a column with their dates and a column for what had been taken. He handed me the folder. I asked him why he was showing it to me. He said, "Because you were on that mountain when it happened to your friend, and I do not want this folder to outlive me without somebody knowing what is in it." I took the folder. I drove back to Cosby that evening. The folder rode on the seat next to me. I took the back road by the river because I wanted the long way home. I keep the folder at the house, not at the ranger station, not in the truck. I put it on top of the refrigerator the day I got back from Newport because that was the highest flat surface in the kitchen. It lives there now. I do not open it. Tri-Corner Knob got walked by a younger crew the next summer, and they did fine. I did not put my name in for it. The part that bothers me is not whether the High Whistler is still up there. I know it is. The part that bothers me is that I think it knew, the night we lost Coin, that we were not coming up the trunk after him. I think it set him in that fork because it wanted us to see what it had done. I think the loggers in the late 1920s knew what they were looking at. And I think the file on top of my refrigerator is just the 8 times somebody happened to write it down. I am 56 years old, and I have been in these mountains my whole life, and there are nights I sit on the porch at home, and I think about what one long thin sound from a tree might be telling somebody right now. On the other side of the ridge, in a stand of Fraser fir I have not walked in years. And I close my eyes, and I sit a while, and I think about Coin, and then I go inside. That is the part you should know. In May of 2023, on a closed service road above Bunches Creek near Cherokee, North Carolina, a 57-year-old Cherokee park ranger made a routine maintenance call that got one of his crew killed. A culvert under the road had plugged with mud, and runoff was cutting at the track the rescue trucks used. From the road, it looked like a drainage problem and maybe a sick bear. The ranger ordered the grate pried off so the crew could clear the pipe by hand. What he did not understand, until it was too late to take it back, was that the old culvert, a collapsed mica cut and a dry wash above the creek, had grown together over the years into one shelter. He had not led his crew into a hunt. He had opened a den. Everything after that came down to who he could keep breathing and what he was willing to give up to do it. The things in the pipe are what that country calls Okona lopers, by the few who have a name for them at all. This is his account. Real quick before we start. If true horror is your thing, hit subscribe and like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, let's begin. My name is Jonas Eubanks, and this happened to me in 2023, above Cherokee, North Carolina. I was 57 then, working as a backcountry park ranger on the North Carolina side. I am Cherokee, born in the Qualla boundary, and I knew those drainages well enough to be lazy about them. That was part of the problem. I had walked Bunches Creek, Mingus Creek, and the Oconaluftee side since I was a boy, and familiar ground can make a man careless in small ways. The work order came in on Tuesday, May 16th. A hard rain had run down the west shoulder of a service road above Bunches Creek and cut a channel under the downhill tire track. That road was not open to visitors. We used it for rescue access, trail maintenance, and moving supplies to a small pump shed that fed a ranger-use water tank lower on the slope. I took 4 people with me because the storm had left more than one problem in that drainage. Amos Keener was our maintenance foreman, 61, built square, with a left knee that clicked when he climbed out of a truck. Vera Ledford was a state wildlife biologist, 42, sent because 2 hikers had reported a sick black bear near the same road. Quentin Vale was a volunteer trail captain, 35, the kind of man who could carry a rock bar 3 miles and only complain about the coffee. Tessa Morell was a seasonal ranger, 29, quiet when she was learning and sharp when it mattered. We left the paved road at 2:06 p.m. in an agency utility truck and a smaller service rig. The sky was bright by then, but the forest still dripped from the rain. The cove smelled like leaf mold, wet tulip poplar bark, and diesel off Amos's machine trailer. Quentin said volunteers ought to get hazard pay and ticks. Amos told him he was already overpaid, since nothing was less than nothing. I remember that joke because Amos smiled crooked when he said it, the way he did when he knew he had won. The first wrong detail was the elk sign. A small herd had been feeding in the low meadow by the visitor path all week, and their tracks usually crossed the service road near the lower gate. That day, the tracks came up to the gravel, milled around in a churned patch, and turned back downhill. Vera crouched over the prints and said they had bunched up like stock against a fence. I told her the washout had probably spooked them. That was answer number 1. It was also the first answer that let me keep moving. At 2:42 p.m., we reached the damaged section. The culvert ran under the road at a shallow angle, not straight across. The uphill end was buried under laurel roots and brown gravel. The downhill end had a steel grate bolted over it, because visitors wandered into closed areas, and because small visitors can fit into places adults forget about. The pipe was old corrugated steel, 36 inches across, set before I ever started working there. Water seeped around the uphill blockage and came out of the downhill grate in a thin sheet. That told me the pipe was not packed solid. Something had narrowed the flow without stopping it. Amos saw that too. "We can flag it and wait for the road crew," Amos said. I told him we had weather coming again by midnight and a rescue training scheduled that weekend. I wanted the road safe by Friday. Amos looked down the slope, pushed his cap back, and said, "Your knees can sign the form then. Mine are retired." I laughed because I thought he was being Amos. At 3:03 p.m., Tessa found the second wrong detail. It was a strip of black hair pinched under the lower left corner of the grate. The hair was long, coarse, and greasy between her gloved fingers. Vera said it matched neither a bear rub nor deer hide. She put it in a sample envelope and made a face before she sealed it. "Sour den," she said. That was exactly the smell. Wet pennies, old meat, and the sharp stink under a porch when a possum has died there. It came off the grate when the breeze shifted, Quentin stepped back and said if the bear was in there, he voted the bear got the road. Instead, I made the decision that set the rest of it loose. I told Amos to unbolt the grate and let us clear the mouth by hand before we called for heavier equipment. I said we would stand to the side, keep the pipe opening clear, and give anything inside a path out. I had done that with raccoons, foxes, and one very angry bobcat that came out of a culvert like a thrown hat. No, that is not right. The bobcat came out of a dry ditch, not a culvert. I remember because Amos teased me about that too. The third wrong detail was the gravel. It had not washed downhill. It had been kicked uphill, away from the culvert mouth. A fan of small stones lay against the road berm, and mixed into it were broken laurel roots with fresh pale ends. Vera stood with her hands on her hips and said, "That is digging." At 3:37 p.m., Quentin found the phone. It was wedged behind the right side of the grate, caught between two bars and packed with mud. The case was torn. The glass was cracked across the top third. It still had power, because the screen lit up when Tessa wiped it with her sleeve. The phone was not ours. It had no agency sticker, no evidence tag, nothing that tied it to a current search. Tessa handed it to me because I was the commissioned ranger on scene. I should have bagged it and stopped the job right there. That is the clean procedure. Secure possible evidence, back out, call law enforcement, let investigators decide what comes next. I did not do the clean procedure. I looked at the road cut, the water undercutting the track, and the clouds building again over the ridge. Then I made a second bad decision on top of the first. I opened the last saved audio file. It was 17 seconds long. The recording started with rain tapping on plastic. A woman said, "That is not a dog." A man told her to get behind him. There were 3 hard knocks, like a stick striking pipe. Then came a wet inhale close to the microphone. Not a growl, just air pulled through a throat. The woman screamed one time. The file ended while the scream was still going. Nobody said anything for a few seconds after that. Quentin finally said it was above his volunteer grade. I told Tessa to put the phone in a clean evidence bag from my kit. I radioed dispatch and reported found property with a possible connection to an unknown incident. The dispatcher asked if I needed law enforcement. I looked at the culvert, then at the water cutting the road, then at Amos waiting beside the bolts. I said we might, but I wanted a maintenance hazard secured first. At 3:55 p.m., the first bolt snapped loose. At 4:02, the second bolt came free. The grate shifted at 4:10. Water pushed through harder once the seal broke, and mud belched out around the bottom edge. The stink got stronger. Vera covered her nose with her sleeve. Amos said the pipe had a belly in it, probably crushed under the roadbed, and the blockage might sit 10 or 12 feet in. I put Tessa uphill as lookout, and Quentin downhill with a shovel. Vera stayed to my left with a catch pole she had brought for the reported bear. Amos took the digging bar. I stood at the grate because I had ordered the opening. At 4:18 p.m., the bar slipped into the frame gap, and Amos pulled. The grate came away 6 inches. That was all it took. A gray foreleg shot through the opening and hooked Vera behind the knee. The foreleg had long toes, black nails, and a wrist joint that bent wrong for a dog. Vera hit the gravel on her back. The catch pole clattered away. The head came next, long-muzzled and wet, with black lips peeled back off small teeth set too close together. Amos swung the digging bar down across the muzzle. Bone cracked, blood spotted the grate. The loper did not pull back. It drove forward, shoulder first, and the pipe made a screaming metal scrape as its ribs forced through the gap. Tessa yelled my name. Quentin swung the shovel and caught the gray body across the neck. Vera kicked backward with both heels. The loper bit her right forearm and shook once. I saw skin open. I saw blood mark the gravel in a straight line. I grabbed Vera's vest strap and pulled. Amos grabbed Vera's belt and pulled with me. That is when the second loper took him from inside the pipe. I did not see the second one come through. I saw Amos's hands go from gripping Vera to clawing at the road. The first loper still had Vera's arm. The second had Amos by the hip and upper thigh, from inside the culvert, dragging him back toward a space no human body could fit into. Amos did not call out. He got one hand flat on the road and looked at me, and what was on his face was not fear. It was the look he got when he was pricing a job he already knew he could not afford. Then the pipe took up the slack, and his boots went out from under him. Quentin drove the shovel handle into the gap. The wood broke. Tessa slammed her boot against the grate. I jammed the digging bar through the frame and levered it sideways, trying to pin the first loper's neck. It screamed through its nose, a high, hard nasal blast, with blood bubbling at one nostril. The first loper let go of Vera and snapped at my wrist. Its teeth caught the cuff of my sleeve and tore the cloth. I dropped my left knee onto Vera's shoulder to keep her from sliding toward the pipe. That sounds rough. It was rough. There was no gentle way to keep her out of that hole. I shifted the bar and drove my right boot into the loper's muzzle. The first loper jerked back into the pipe far enough for Vera to roll clear. Quentin and Tessa pulled her by the ankles toward the service rig. Amos was still down. His belt had twisted under my hand. I hooked my fingers through it and pulled until my knuckles cut against the buckle. The second loper pulled harder. Amos's hip tore open against the lower grate edge. I am going to say that plainly, because there is no honest way around it. His work pants split. The skin under them split. The road went red in a wide smear. Amos was alive when I dragged him loose, but the left side of him was opened from his belt to his thigh. The loper inside the pipe let go, because Amos's body jammed against the grate frame. That is the only reason. It lost leverage for 2 seconds, and those 2 seconds gave Quentin room to shove the grate back across the opening. I got Amos clear by 6 feet. Then I got my first aid pack open with hands that would not do what I told them. We were on the service road with one dying man, one badly hurt biologist, one blocked culvert, and at least 2 werewolves inside the road. At 4:23 p.m., I called dispatch again. My voice sounded calm on the recording later. It was not calm from where I was sitting. I gave location, road number, victim count, and injuries. I said we had a large, unidentified canid threat inside the culvert. I did not say werewolf, not then. I requested law enforcement, rescue, medical evacuation, and a road closure at the lower gate. The dispatcher asked if the threat was contained. I looked at the grate. The first loper pressed its muzzle to the gap and breathed through the bars. Blood from its nose mixed with the runoff. One eye showed between the bars, yellow-brown and clear. I said no. Tessa had Vera against the service rig by then. Vera's forearm was pumping blood between Tessa's fingers. Quentin was trying to help Amos, but Quentin had blood on his own pants and did not know why yet. The shovel handle had split and driven a long sliver into his calf. He kept looking down at it like it belonged to somebody else. I put a tourniquet high on Vera's arm at 4:26. I wrote the time on tape and stuck it to her sleeve. Vera tried to tell me the bite had not hit the artery. Then blood ran over my thumb and pulses, and she stopped arguing. Her face went gray around the mouth. For Amos, there was less to do. I packed the hip wound with gauze and pressed both hands into it. His eyes were clear. His right hand came up off the gravel toward the brim of his cap, the way it always did, right before he said something he had already made up his mind about. It stopped halfway. He did not get to push the cap back, and he did not get to say whatever it was. "Stay with me," I said. He breathed twice after that. Then he stopped. Tessa asked if he was gone. I said yes, because she needed the truth fast. Quentin made a sound like he had swallowed wrong. Vera said, "The pipe," and that brought me back to the road. The grate was moving. Not much. Half an inch, maybe less. The lopper inside had braced against the lower bar and was pushing. The bolts were already out. The only thing holding that grate in place was the digging bar through the frame and the weight of the road gravel against the bottom lip. I told Tessa to get Vera into the passenger seat. I told Quentin to leave the sliver in his leg and help her. I put Amos's tool bag against the grate and jammed the broken shovel under it. Then I dragged Amos by the shoulders behind the service rig. I hated doing that. I did it anyway. At 4:31 p.m., the third lopper showed us the culvert was not the only way out. It came down through the laurel above the road, not from the pipe. That meant the drain connected to something under the slope, or the pack had another route around. The third one was smaller, with reddish-gray hair along the spine. It moved on all fours until it reached the road edge. Then it rose on its hind legs, just long enough to look over the hood of the service rig. Tessa saw it first. She did not scream. She said, "Left side, the flat way you call out a backing trailer." The smaller loper came over the hood and smashed the windshield with both forefeet. Glass fell into the cab. Vera was half in, half out, and the loper snapped at her boot. Quentin hit it with the metal shovel head. The blow cut one ear. The loper dropped off the hood and landed on all fours. It bled. I saw that. Red blood. Bright on gray hair. That mattered, because my mind was trying to turn the whole scene into fog and old stories. The cut ear gave me something solid. It had a body. It had blood. It had the weight to dent a hood and crack glass. I drew my sidearm halfway, then stopped. Vera was between me and the loper. Tessa was behind it. Quentin was in my line. A round in that knot of people would have been another casualty. I shoved the sidearm back down and grabbed the flare kit off the service rig floorboard. I used it as a hard box and threw the case at the smaller loper's face. It bounced off the muzzle. The loper flinched, and Tessa hauled Vera the rest of the way into the cab. The service rig was no good after that. The windshield was gone. The downhill tire was sinking into soft shoulder, and Amos was behind it. The utility truck sat 30 yards uphill with its nose pointed at the lower gate. If we could get everyone into that truck, we could back down to the paved road. At 4:38 p.m., I made a choice I still defend and still hate. I left Amos where he was. I told Quentin to help Tessa move Vera uphill. I stayed at the grate for 8 more minutes, wedging the tool bag, broken handle, and digging bar into the frame. I was not trying to trap the pack. I was buying time to move the living. The first lopper hit the grate 3 times while I worked. Each hit shoved metal against my boots. On the third hit, one black nail came through the bars and sliced the leather above my ankle. I felt the cut, but not the pain. The pain waited until later when I was filling out forms and my sock had dried stiff. By 4:46 p.m., we had Vera in the back seat of the utility truck. Tessa sat with her and kept the tourniquet where she could see it. Quentin climbed in front, then climbed out again because his leg would not bend. I had to flatten the sliver enough to get him seated. He told me this was why volunteers needed dental. I got behind the wheel and backed down the road at 4:49 p.m. We had Amos behind us, the wrecked service rig, and the pipe. The smaller lopper paced us for the first 20 yards inside the laurel. It did not charge. It watched the truck through gaps in the leaves and kept even with us, shoulder low, head forward. At 4:52 p.m., the road dropped into the switchback above the pump shed. That shed was cinder block, one room, with a steel door, a small louvered vent, and a floor drain tied into the same old water line. I knew about the drain because I had signed off on a maintenance note about it 3 years earlier. A white oak had come down across the service road below the switchback, not a sapling. A full tree, roots lifted, crown buried in the downhill laurel. The storm had dropped it after we drove in. The trunk blocked the road from bank to bank. Tessa asked if we could move it. I said no. A chainsaw was on the service rig we had left behind. The rescue team coming up from below would need a saw too. The utility truck could not climb the root plate, and backing uphill toward the culvert would put us right back in the pack's path. So we went into the pump shed. At 4:58 p.m., I got Vera through the steel door. Tessa followed with the medical bag. Quentin came in last, hopping and swearing under his breath. I shut the door and threw the inside bolt. Then I dragged a metal storage cabinet against it. The cabinet was full of pipe fittings and old valves and smelled like mouse droppings. The shed gave us block walls and a steel door. That was all it gave us. The radio worked if I stood near the vent. I gave dispatch the new location and said we were blocked by a downed tree above the lower gate. Dispatch said county rescue was cutting in from below, law enforcement was closing the road, and the first medical unit was staged at the visitor lot. Estimated contact was 40 minutes, if the lower approach was clear. Vera's tourniquet was holding, but she had lost a lot of blood. Her right hand had gone waxy. She kept asking whether Amos was inside with us. Tessa looked at me once. I shook my head. Tessa told Vera to save her breath. Quentin's calf wound was ugly but not pumping. I wrapped it tight and told him not to pull the wood out. He asked if I was serious. I said yes. He said that made two of us. The shed had one high window painted shut and the floor drain. The drain was a 6-inch round grate set in concrete near the back wall. It was supposed to run to a short outflow. It was not supposed to run to a cave, or a den, or anywhere big enough for a body to move through. That is what I kept telling myself when water started backing up through it. At 5:07 p.m., the first lopper reached the shed door. It did not slam into it. It sniffed along the threshold. I could hear wet air moving under the door. Then one nail tapped the metal, slow and careful. Tessa whispered, asking if it was testing the door. Yes, I said. Quentin threw a pipe fitting at the vent. It hit the wall beside the slats. The lopper dropped away. We heard its feet hit the gravel outside. At 5:12 p.m., the floor drain clicked. I looked down and saw one black nail come up through a slot in the drain cover. The smaller loper was under the shed. The drain cover lifted a 1/4 inch, then it dropped. The loper below it changed its angle and tried again. I knelt on the cover with my left knee. My cut ankle left a red print on the concrete. I told Tessa to hand me the longest pipe wrench from the cabinet. She handed me a wrench. I laid it through the drain slots and turned it sideways so it caught under the grate. The cover stopped lifting. Then Vera stopped answering questions. That changed everything. I could not keep my knee on the drain and keep Vera alive at the same time. Tessa could not hold pressure, watch Vera's breathing, and watch the door all at once. Quentin could not stand without help. The loper outside had gone quiet. The one under the floor was still working at the drain. I chose Vera. I left the wrench through the drain cover and crawled to her. Her breathing had gone shallow. Her lips were pale. Blood had soaked the towel under her arm. I checked the tourniquet, tightened it one more turn, and put 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse was there, but thin. "Talk to me," I said. Her eyes moved, but she did not speak. Tessa said, "Jonas, drain." The wrench had shifted. Quentin slid off the wall, half falling, half sitting onto the drain cover. He got his good leg across it and pressed both boots against the back wall. The cover dropped flush. Under him, something scraped at the metal with the tips of its nails, fast, then slow. "I am sitting on a werewolf," Quentin said. "Keep sitting," I said. At 5:18 p.m., I radioed dispatch and told them 1 deceased, 3 injured, active threat at the shed. Dispatch asked if the threat was human or wildlife. I said wildlife, because that was the box they had. Then I corrected myself and said, "Unknown large canid, using the drains. Tell rescue not to walk into the road cut." At 5:21 p.m., the first loper hit the door. The cabinet jumped back 6 inches. Pipe fittings spilled across the floor. Tessa grabbed the cabinet handle and threw her weight against it. I was still at Vera's side. Quentin was still on the drain. The loper hit the door again. The steel bowed inward at the latch. Tessa yelled that she could not hold it. I packed Vera's wound again, pressed Tessa's hands over it, and moved to the cabinet. My ankle slipped on the blood. I hit the door shoulder first. The next impact drove the cabinet into my ribs. I felt one rib give, or maybe it was cartilage. The pain came white and quick. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste it. The lopper outside changed tactics. It quit hitting the door and started digging at the threshold. The shed had a 2-inch gap where the concrete had chipped under the frame. Nails scraped there. Gravel clicked. A black nose pressed into the gap, then a strip of lip. It was working to get teeth under the door. I took the broken shovel head from Quentin's pack and drove the metal edge down through the gap. It cut something. The lopper yelped, short and sharp, and pulled back. Blood ran under the door in a thin line. The body outside moved off through the gravel. The one under the drain answered with a nasal blast from below the floor. At 5:27 p.m., Tessa gave one cracked laugh and said she had signed up to point out bathrooms. That was the false calm. At 5:34 p.m., Vera woke enough to whisper, "There were 3. I told her we had seen 3. She shook her head, barely. "No, 3 at the road, 1 under." I looked at the drain under Quentin. He looked back at me and said, "Do not add." At 5:37 p.m., the high window broke. Not from outside, from above. A lopper had climbed onto the shed roof off the bank behind it and dropped its forebody through the window frame. Glass fell across the concrete. The opening was too narrow for hips, but the shoulders came through far enough for the head and one forelimb to hang inside the room. It snapped at the air above Tessa. Its nails raked the wall and tore the paint down to block. Tessa dropped flat. I grabbed the catch pole we had carried in during the scramble and shoved the loop up over the loper's muzzle. The pole was built for raccoons and hurt foxes. Against that body, it felt like trying to steer a wet log with a broomstick. The loper twisted, and the cable loop slid behind its teeth. It bit down and crushed the pole tube half flat. Quentin shouted from the drain, asking if I needed him. "Stay down," I said. The loper in the window kicked against the outside wall. Its hind claws scraped block. Its weight widened the frame. Another 2 inches and it would be through. I put both hands on the pole and pushed up, trying to choke its angle instead of its throat. Tessa crawled under the reach of its forelimb and grabbed Vera's collar to pull her away from the glass. Vera moaned. That small sound pulled the loper's head toward her. I changed my grip and drove the pole sideways. The loper's head hit the window frame. It bit through the cable and the pole went slack. Its forelimb came down and hooked my shoulder strap, tearing the radio harness across my chest. I felt nails scrape skin through my shirt. I did something then that was not brave and was not planned. I shoved my left forearm into its mouth. I had a heavy leather glove on that hand from the road work. The loper bit the glove and my sleeve instead of Tessa's neck. Its teeth went through the leather into the meat along my forearm. I pushed deeper, because pulling back would have opened me from wrist to elbow. Then I drove my right thumb into the cut on its ear, the one Quentin had made out at the road. The lopper let go. I looked at my arm. The glove was punctured in 4 places. Blood moved under the leather but did not spray. I kept the glove on because I was afraid of what the skin would do if I pulled it off. No, I am mixing that up. I pulled the glove off later, in the ambulance, not in the shed. In the shed, I only looked at the holes and flexed my fingers once. At 5:41 p.m., the drain cover lifted under Quentin. He could not hold it any longer. His hurt leg had started shaking. The loper underneath had switched from lifting to twisting, and the pipe wrench turned in the slots. I grabbed the wrench and pushed down. The drain cover bit into the skin of my palm. Tessa went back to Vera. Vera's eyes were open, but not focused on anything. That is when the choice came at me plain and ugly. I had a sidearm. The loper at the window had left blood on the block. If I went outside, I might get a shot at one. I might get a body. No supervisor, no report reviewer, no investigator from anywhere could soften a body into bear encounter or feral dog event. Amos was dead. Part of me wanted one of those things on the ground next to him. Vera coughed once. Blood bubbled at her lips because she had bitten her tongue when Tessa dragged her. That little red bubble made the decision for me. I stayed with the living. At 5:43 p.m., I told Tessa to take over the drain. She said she could not hold it. I told her she did not have to hold it long. I moved back to Vera, opened her airway, and turned her head so she would not choke. I checked her pulse again. Faster now, weaker. Her skin was cold under my fingers. Outside, men were shouting from below the treefall. Their voices were still too far down the slope. I heard a saw start, then bind, then start again. Rescue was maybe 200 yards off, with a whole oak between us and them. The lopper under the drain pushed. Tessa slid backward. Quentin rolled off the cover and tried to help, but his calf would not take the weight. The cover rose an inch. A muzzle pressed up under it. I saw teeth through the slot. I could not leave Vera. I told Quentin to throw fittings. He threw a brass valve and hit the drain cover. Tessa found a length of pipe and drove it down through the gap. The loper's mouth closed on the pipe. Tessa pushed with both hands. Quentin shoved a cabinet shelf across the cover. The pipe bent. The loper let go. The cover dropped again. At 5:48 p.m., rescue reached the shed wall. They did not open the door right away, because I had told dispatch about the drain line and the road cut. The first rescuer called through the vent and asked how many inside. I said, 4 living, 1 deceased uphill, active threat outside, unknown count. He repeated it back. Then he said they were going to make noise and light before they came in. A siren chirped from below in 3 short bursts. Then a rescue worker set off a blank cracker shell from the lower road. The report cracked through the cove. The loper at the back wall ran. We heard it go through the laurel, heavy, then fast. The drain scraped once under Tessa's pipe and went still. The rescue team opened the door at 5:51 p.m. They came in behind a shield, with a long pole and 2 medical bags and faces that changed when they saw the floor. I remember one of them stepping around the blood under the door because he thought it was a puddle of water. Then his boot dragged red across the concrete, and he looked down. I handed Vera off first. I made myself say the tourniquet time, the bite location, the estimated blood loss, the mental status, and that she had lost consciousness twice. The medic nodded and repeated the tourniquet time back to me. That repetition was what let me let go of her arm. Quentin went next. He tried to stand and nearly folded. Tessa would not sit until somebody else took over Vera's pressure dressing. Then Tessa sat down on the concrete and put her hands in her lap, palms up, like she was waiting for soap. I was last, because I could still talk. At 6:03 p.m., 2 law officers and 3 rescuers moved uphill toward Amos. I told them not to go near the culvert mouth. They did not listen at first. Then the smaller lopper, the one with the cut ear, stepped onto the road above the service rig and showed itself in full sun. Everyone saw it. It stood maybe 5.5 feet at the shoulder when it hunched, taller when it lifted up. The body was built like a lean man folded into the front end of a wolf. The hair lay flat where it was wet. The forelimbs were long enough for the nails to touch gravel when it stood upright. The muzzle was narrow. One ear was split. Blood spotted the side of its face and neck. A law officer raised a long gun. The loper dropped to all fours and went over the downhill bank before the trigger broke. He held fire because the bank below was full of people, and he had no safe line either. The cut-ear loper crossed the slope below the road, moving through the laurel so fast the leaves snapped shut behind it. Then another gray body crossed above it. Then a third moved higher, up near the old mica cut. They did not run the way deer or coyotes run. They used the folds in the ground. They dropped into washes, came up under roots, and went out of sight behind walls of rhododendron, because the terrain gave them cover, and they knew it. The pack got away in front of 7 witnesses. No body was recovered. No clear picture came out of the scene. A rescue worker's chest camera caught 8 seconds of the cut-ear-loper at the road edge, but water blurred the lens and the body was half behind the service rig. The official wording came out as unidentified large canid group. That wording sounded thin. It also fit the scraps of evidence they had. At 6:22 p.m., they brought Amos down in a litter with a sheet over him. Tessa stood up when she saw it. She had no reason to stand. She stood anyway. Quentin took off his cap and held it against his chest, and I caught myself thinking Amos would be sore about that, because Quentin had dropped blood on the brim. I rode out in the second medical vehicle. My forearm had 4 punctures and a crushed place near the wrist. My ankle cut needed cleaning. My ribs were bruised, maybe cracked. Tessa had glass cuts and a sprained wrist. Quentin had the calf puncture and a broken bone in his foot from the first scramble at the road. Vera made it to surgery. Amos did not come back down the mountain alive. The next day, investigators closed the service road. They mapped the culvert, the pump shed drain, the old utility trench, and the mica adit above the slope. The connections were real. Water had opened passages between them over the years, and the pack had dug some of them wider. Hair came off 3 different points. Blood from the grate and the shed door went to a lab. I never saw the final report. I saw one preliminary note that said the samples were canid and inconclusive past that. On Friday, May 19th, I gave my formal statement in a room behind the visitor desk. Tessa gave hers after me. Quentin gave his from a clinic bed over video. Vera was still sedated. The law officer who had almost taken the shot asked me why I had not fired inside the shed. I told him the truth. Every time I had a weapon up, a person was in the line, or a person was bleeding out behind me, and I never once had both a clear shot and nothing better to do with my hands. The word Oconee Lopers is in none of those files. The files say, unidentified large canid group, and that is what they will say in 50 years when somebody pulls the box. I will not pretend an old man stopped what he was doing and handed me the name like a key, because that is not how I got it. I do not even know where I first heard it. Maybe from men who used to work the river drains and are mostly gone now. Maybe I put the shape of it together myself after, when I needed something to call them that was not the thing that took Amos. The name lives in my mouth, and nowhere with a stamp on it. That is the part the choice cost me. I had a chance at proof on the ground, and I spent it on Vera's pulse, and I would spend it the same way again. And because I spent it that way, there is nothing left to show anyone. Just a torn phone, a thin lab note, and 5 people who were there. Vera kept the arm. She is back doing field work, with a brace and a scar that runs the length of her forearm. She came to see me at the station in the fall. The only one of us a missing body would have meant the most to, because she is the one trained to want the specimen. She did not ask about the specimen. She asked if I had slept. I said not much. She said that tracked, and we sat on the porch and did not talk about it, which was the most either of us could do. I still work that district. I do not go up the Bunches Creek Service Road by myself, and I will not open a closed pipe for anyone's deadline again, as long as I carry a badge. The road is gated. The den is still under the mountain. We sealed one mouth of it, and there were at least 3. Some nights I think about the connections running under all that quiet ground, and the pack moving through them the way they moved through the laurel, low and certain, using folds in the earth that were there long before the road was. If there is one thing I would tell a man before he sends a crew up to a hole in the ground in the spring, it is this. You count who came with you before you count your tools. I learned that at 57, with my hands in a dead friend's hip, and I paid the full price for it, and I am the only stamp it will ever get. In 1994, in the backcountry of Henry Coe State Park east of Morgan Hill, California, a young state park ranger drove an old ranch road to run down a smoke report and found a family that nearly killed the youngest man on his crew. He went up that road with 2 other people and a job that should have taken an hour. He came back down it with a broken man on the floor of his truck, and another man down on the road behind him. The people up that canyon did not want visitors. They had been living up there off an old mining claim since before the valley below had a proper name, and they had a way of handling anyone who came up the only road in. The way was old, and it worked. By the time the ranger understood what he had driven into, they had dropped a tree across the road below him. They had put a man out in front of the truck with one hand raised, the way you stop a car you expect to stop. They had been ahead of him the whole time. If you have ever stood somewhere quiet outdoors and felt the place go still in a way that has nothing to do with the wind, you have a thin idea of the first few seconds at that gate. You would have told yourself the same thing he did. You would have said, "It is a fire, we have to look." You would have opened the gate too. They had him closed in on 3 sides with the blocked road as the 4th, and the light was going, and the only way out ran straight through a man who would not move. What follows is his account. Before this story begins, if you're into chilling horror, take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good scare. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop it in the comments. Thank you for the support, it really does mean a lot. All right, let's get into it. My name is Grady Jansen, and this happened to me back in 1994, in the dry hills of Henrico State Park, east of Morgan Hill, California. I had been a ranger there a little over 4 years by then. I was the youngest guy in the district with a permanent post. I was also the kind of young that thinks the job is about doing the job right, and not at all about knowing when to leave a thing alone. That part matters, so I am telling you up front. A lot of what happened that day happened because I wanted to be the man who handled it instead of the man who turned around. I was good with the back roads. That was my thing in the district, the part of the job nobody else wanted. I kept the old maps. I knew which fire roads washed out first and which cattle gates were hung wrong and where the culverts were going under. I could read a bad road the way some people read weather. I tell you that because it is the reason I am still here, and it is also the reason 2 other people almost were not. The thing that started it was a smoke report. We had come off the driest summer I could remember, the grass gone the color of paper by June, and everybody in the district was jumpy about fire. A spotter plane working the range that week called in a thin column of smoke from a drainage on the east side. It was back in country with no marked road and no campground, and no reason for anybody to be lighting anything. The plane could not get a fix on it. The smoke was thin, the canyon was deep, and the light was bad by the time they came around for a second pass. So they sent us to put eyes on it from the ground. That was the whole reason we drove in. A column of smoke a plane could not explain. Us was 3 people. Me and a kid named Marco Delgado, who was 24 and ran our trail and maintenance crew on a seasonal contract, and a woman named Tess Okafor, who was 41 and worked fire prevention for the state forestry department. Tess was the reason there were 3 of us instead of just me. A smoke report in October is a fire matter, and she needed a ranger who knew the back roads to drive her in. Marco came because Marco had spent 3 seasons on a wildland fire crew before he came to us, and he could read a burn better than anybody I had, and honestly, because he asked. He was bored. October is slow. I should tell you about Marco, because he is the one this nearly killed. He narrated everything. He had a comment about every gate and every cattle guard and every dead oak. He had strong opinions about which energy bar was structurally better, which is a real argument we had on the drive in, and I lost it because he turned out to be right and I knew nothing about it. I tell you that because I want you to know him as a person and not as a thing that got hurt. He was funny. He was also a careful person, and that is the part that aches, because he was the one telling me to slow down. Here is the thing about the park that you need to understand. It is enormous. People do not realize that. It is one of the biggest state parks in California, something like 80,000 acres of oak and grass and steep, brushy ridges that all look the same from the air, and most of it has no road at all. The state pieced it together over decades, buying up old cattle ranches one at a time as the families sold out or died off. Some of those old ranches still had a house or a barn falling down on them somewhere back in the folds of the hills. You find old ranch junk all over that park. That is normal. But here and there, the way it goes with land that big, there were a few spots the state never got. Private inholdings, old patented mining claims from the Mercury days, little squares of deed sitting inside the park boundary like seeds nobody could dig out. Hang on to that. It matters later. The old ranch road we needed was on the maps but had not been driven in years. It branched off a graded fire road and ran east toward the drainage where the spotter saw the smoke. We took the patrol truck, the beat-up four-wheel drive the district kept for the rough roads, and we let the tires down at the turnoff for traction and went in slow. The road was bad the way old ranch roads get bad, washed out at the dips, brush leaning in from both sides, so it dragged down the doors. But here is the first thing that was wrong, and at the time, I would not let myself see it as wrong. The road was better than it had any right to be. Somebody had pulled rock out of the worst washout and laid it back as fill. Somebody had cut the brush off the bad turns, and not long ago, with a blade and not a saw, because the cuts were ragged and crushed instead of clean. I remember thinking the county must have run a crew up here, which made no sense because the county had no business on park land, and I knew that. I thought it anyway. It was the explanation that let me keep driving. Marco was the one who said it out loud. He looked at a fresh-cut clump of brush and said somebody works this road. Tess said with what? A machete. Marco said with a machete, and they both kind of laughed. I did not, because something in me was already counting. I just did not know yet what I was counting. We came to the gate a couple miles in, or it felt like a couple miles. I never tripped the odometer, so do not hold me to it. It was an old wire and pipe gate hung in a barbed wire fence, and the fence was the boundary of one of those inholdings I told you about. There was a sign on it, the kind a person makes himself, white paint gone gray, and it said no trespassing. And under that, in the same hand, it said this means you. I have always thought that is a strange thing to bother painting. Who else would it mean? The chain on the gate was the second thing that was wrong. It was looped through and hung back on the post, but it was hung on the inside. From the road, you could not have reached across to close it that way. Somebody had shut that gate standing on the canyon side. Tess saw it the same second I did, and she said, well, somebody is back in here. And Marco said maybe a hunter, and I said the smoke is past this gate, and that was the whole conversation. That was the point of no return, and the three of us treated it like a parking decision. I want to be honest about this. I am the one who opened the gate. Tess deferred to me because it was parkland and I was the ranger and the smoke was my call. Marco said, you sure? And I said, it is a fire. We have to look. So I lifted the chain off the inside post, which meant reaching across, and I drove us through. Then I got out and closed it behind us the same way it had been hung on the inside. That is what you do with a gate. You leave it how you found it. I have thought about that a great deal since. I closed us in. The land past the gate changed. It got steeper and the oaks got bigger and older, the kind with trunks you could not get your arms around. The road dropped into the head of the canyon, along a creek that still had a little water in it that late in a dry year. It was pretty. I will say that for it. It was the prettiest part of the whole park, and nobody ever got to see it. There were old diggings in that part of the range if you knew to look. Little prospect pits and caved-in mine mouths left from the Mercury boom 100 years back, when half of these hills had men in them chasing cinnabar. The creeks down low still ran a faint rust color in places where the old workings bled into them. I had seen those red seeps lower in the park. I did not think about any of it that day. I only bring it up because later it turned out to matter where these people had come from, and a piece of the answer was in that red dirt. But I am getting ahead of myself. We found the car a ways in. It was off the road in a stand of buckeye, almost swallowed by it, an old sedan from sometime in the 70s, the kind of car nobody made anymore. It had gone the brown-red color metal goes when it has sat outside untouched for a long time. The tires were flat and rotted off the rims. There were oak seedlings coming up through the open hood where the engine should have been. Marco wanted to look at it, and I wanted to keep moving toward the smoke. And Tess settled it by saying a vehicle out here is something we report no matter what. So we stopped. The plates were so faded you could barely read them, and they were not current and had not been for a long time. Then Marco found the rest of it. Back in the brush behind the car, there was a day pack, the nylon gone to gray rags, the zippers rusted shut. There was a single hiking boot, just the one, the leather curled up hard like a dried leaf. There was a plastic cooler with no lid, full of dead leaves. And inside the pack, in a freezer bag that had somehow held all that time, there was a folded park map and a driver license belonging to a woman none of us had ever heard of. It had expired in 1981. We all went quiet looking at that license. I do not remember anybody saying anything for a while. Tess took it and slid it into an evidence sleeve from her kit. Fire investigation is half forensics, and she carried the kit out of habit. She wrote the spot in her notebook, slow, the way you write a thing when your head is already going somewhere you do not like. Tess had a way of going very still and very capable when a situation went bad, and I would come to understand that this was the most frightening tell she had. She was a talker too, in her own dry way, and when she stopped talking it meant she had done the math. She had worked fire for almost 20 years and walked a lot of burned ground and seen what fire leaves behind. I think she understood before either of us did that we were standing in a different kind of aftermath. I told myself it was a dump. People dump cars on remote land all the time. The pack could have washed down the creek in a wet year. The license could have fallen out of somebody's load years back. I built the whole story standing right there, and I believed about half of it. I think Tess believed less than half. Marco believed none of it, because Marco had gone quiet, and a quiet Marco was not a thing that happened in nature. Whose car it was, I never found out, even after. The license belonged to a woman reported missing out of Stockton in 1980. Nobody ever tied her to the car, and the car had no record anyone could trace, like it had driven up that canyon and stopped existing. That one stays open. I have made a kind of peace with not knowing. We should have turned around there. I knew it then, and I know it now. But the smoke was real, and it was close, and a fire on parkland in a dry October is not a thing you drive away from on a hunch. I told myself we would put eyes on the source, confirm it, call it in, and be back at the gate before long. So we kept going up the canyon toward the smoke. I want you to notice that I am still doing it there, still finding the version of the day where staying makes sense. That is the part of me that almost got Marco killed. The smoke turned out to be a place. The road climbed a last pitch and came out on a flat bench above the creek, maybe 2 acres of cleared ground, and on it sat a homestead. Not a ruin, a working one. There was an old board house, sagging but roofed, with smoke coming thin out of a stovepipe. That was our smoke. A wood stove. Not a wildfire at all. There were sheds. There was a low building out back that I understood after a second was a smokehouse, because there were strips of something dark hanging in the open door of it. There was a garden, fenced high with brush and wire. There were hides stretched on frames in the yard. There was a pile of bones off to one side, clean, sorted by size, which I noticed and filed away and did not let myself understand. And there was no power line, no propane tank, no vehicle, nothing at all that tied this place to the year 1994. Tess said it quiet. People live here. That was the moment the day turned over. It did not announce itself. Tess just said a true thing in a flat voice, and that was all it took. People lived back here, off the deed of an old claim, with no road they would admit to, and a gate they closed from the inside. They had been at it long enough to wear a path to the creek a foot deep. Nobody in the district had the first idea. Here is the thing about being a ranger. The whole job is built on the idea that the land belongs to everybody, and you are just the person who keeps an eye on it. You are not used to the feeling of being somewhere you are not supposed to be. I had that feeling standing on that bench, hard, the trespasser feeling, and it took me a second to understand it was correct. We were the trespassers. This was their ground. The sign on the gate had meant us after all. I keyed the radio to call it in and got nothing but the hiss you get when the canyon walls eat the signal. We were too deep and too low. Out there, the radio was all we had. There were no phones to speak of in that country in 1994, and there would not have been a bar of anything down in that hole, even if we had carried one. I told the other two we would back out to the ridge and call from up high, nice and easy, and I started getting the truck turned around in the cleared yard. It took 3 points because the yard was tight, and on the second point Marco said, "Real quiet, Grady, the ridge." There was a man standing on the ridge above the house. I only saw him for a second before he stepped back. He was tall, and he was dressed in clothes that did not come from any store, layered hide and canvas gone the color of the dirt, and he was just watching us turn the truck around. He watched the way you watch something you have already made up your mind about. Then he was gone behind the oaks. Not running, just gone, the way a person goes when he knows the ground and you do not. There were 3 of them, or 3 that I saw anyway. I keep wanting to say 4 because of the man on the ridge, but I only ever counted 3 of them down close, and the one on the ridge may have been one of those 3. My memory of the count is the one part I do not trust. I got the truck pointed back down the road, and I did not floor it. Some calm part of me said, "Do not let them see you panic." That calm part was right, and I have never been more grateful to a part of myself for anything. We started back down the way we came. Marco was twisted around in the back seat watching the slopes. Tess had the evidence sleeve flat in her lap with her hand on top of it like it might blow away. Nobody talked. The only sound was the truck crawling over rock. We made it maybe a quarter mile before the first one came at us. He came out of the brush on the uphill side, fast, faster than a person ought to move through buckscrub, and he did not come at the truck. He came into the road in front of it and stopped. Just stood there in the road. He was younger than the man on the ridge, maybe a teenager, and he had a length of pipe in one hand. He stood there and looked at us through the windshield, and he did not raise the pipe. He just held it. He looked, I think now, like somebody who had run out ahead of a thing and was not sure he was supposed to be there yet. That hesitation is the only reason I am alive. Because in the second he stood there not raising the pipe, I understood the whole shape of it. They were not trying to scare us off. They were stopping us. One in the road meant others, and others meant the road, and the road was the only way out, and the road had a gate on it that I had closed from the inside like a fool. I put the truck in reverse instead of forward, which I think surprised him, and I backed up hard around the bend we had just come down, and that is when the rock came through the back glass. It was a real rock, the size of a grapefruit, and it came off the uphill slope and took out the rear window and hit Marco square in the shoulder and knocked him flat across the seat. He made a sound I had never heard him make in 3 years of working next to him. The glass went everywhere, little green cubes of it down the back of his collar and across the seat and into the floor wells. Tess was already turned around with both hands on him. I kept the truck moving, backward, my eyes going between the mirror and the slope. I got us up into the cleared yard again. It was the only open ground, and there was nowhere else to put us while I figured out what to do. That was the false bottom of the whole thing. The yard. For about a minute, sitting in that yard with the engine running and nobody in sight, I let myself think the rock might be the worst of it. Tess was checking Marco, telling him in a low, even voice that he was okay, that it was the shoulder, that he could still move the arm. Marco was swearing in a way that meant he was scared and not dying. I sat there and let myself believe for that 1 minute that the 3 of us were going to drive out of there shaken and whole. Marco, flat across the seat with Tess pressing both hands on his shoulder, asked me if the energy bars were still in the door pocket, because he figured he was going to need the calories. I laughed. One short, ugly bark of a laugh, because it was such a Marco thing to say, and because I needed somewhere to put what was sitting in my chest. Then I looked down the road we needed, and they had dropped a tree across it. Not a small one. A whole oak limb, fresh, the cut end pale, laid across the narrowest part of the road below us where the bank came up steep on both sides. They had done it while we were stopped at the car, or while we stood on the bench, or in the minute the kid held us with the pipe. They had been ahead of us the entire time. The smoke we drove half the morning to find had not been a fire. It had been bait to draw somebody up the road, or it had been nothing but a family cooking and keeping warm the way they did every day of their lives back in there. I will never know which, and it does not change anything. We had driven up a canyon to a place that had a way of dealing with people who drove up the canyon. The way was old, and it worked, and we were inside it now. I am going to slow down here, because this is the part of the day I can still walk through second by second, and the rest of it I have lost. The light was going. October light in those canyons goes fast once the sun gets behind the west ridge, and we had been in there long enough that the bottoms were already gray. Marco's shoulder was bad. The rock had broken something, and he had gone the gray-white color that scared me worse than the blood did. A man who is hurt and cold and scared in a place with no help is on a clock whether you can see it or not. I could see it. I had maybe an hour of light, a hurt man, a road blocked below us, a gate closed below that, and people moving on the slopes who knew this ground in the dark and did not need light at all. There was a man down by the tree they had dropped, the older one, from the ridge. He was standing on the road by the limb with his hands loose at his sides, not hiding, letting me see him. And that was worse than the rock. It meant he was not worried. He had us figured. The kid with the pipe was up the slope to my left now. There was a third one I never got a clean look at, low and off to the right, moving in the brush along the creek. I understood we were being closed in on 3 sides with the blocked road as the 4th. Herded is the word I keep landing on. We were being herded into the dark, and once it was dark, it would not matter that there were 3 of us. So I made the second decision that day I have to live with. The limb across the road was at the Narrows, but the Narrows had a low spot on the creek side where the bank had washed out, where the shoulder dropped a couple feet to a gravel bar. I knew that spot. I had read it on the way in, the way you read bad road, the way Marco read a burn, because in 4 years you learn to clock every soft shoulder and washout you cross. If I came down on it fast, in low range, on the gravel bar side, I thought I could get the truck around the butt end of the limb where it did not quite reach the drop. Thought. I was not sure. If I was wrong, we were going to hang the truck up on a log in the dark with hurt people in it, and that would be the end of all 3 of us. I told Tess to get Marco down on the floor and brace. I told her flat, no discussion, because there was no time to be the careful kind of man I usually try to be. She did it without a word. I think about that. How fast a person can decide to trust you when there is nothing else left. Marco said something I did not catch, and I said, "Hold on." And I came down off the bench in low gear with my foot in it. The older man stepped into the road. He stepped right into the middle of it, in front of the limb, square between us and the gap I was driving for. And he raised one hand, palm out, the way you stop a car you expect to stop. He had done it before. You could see that he had done it before. That one gesture had worked on other people and other trucks in other years, and they had stopped. And that was how the canyon filled its bone pile and grew its oak seedlings up through old engine blocks. I did not stop. I want to be clear about what I did, because I have had to be clear about it many times since. To the sheriff, to the district, to myself at 3 a.m. for a lot of years. I did not aim for him. I aimed for the gap on the creek side, the washed-out low spot, and he stepped into the line of the gap. I had a hurt man on the floor of my truck, a blocked road, the dark coming down. I did not lift my foot. The truck hit him. It caught him at the front corner and he went down and under. I felt it in the wheel and in the floor of the truck, a heavy, soft jolt. I have never been able to describe it to anybody, and I have stopped trying. The truck bucked over the gravel bar and around the end of the limb, and the back end slewed and caught the log and tore loose, and we were past it. We were on open road below the Narrows, and I did not stop, and I did not look back, and I drove. The kid with the pipe ran along the slope beside us for a stretch, pacing the truck the way a dog runs a fence line. He was close enough that I could hear him over the engine. Then the road dropped, and he fell away behind us. Nobody else came into the road. We got down to the gate, and I did not slow for it. I hit it with the brush guard, and it tore off the post in a tangle of wire. We dragged 20 feet of fence with us and went through. Then we were back on the old ranch road in the last of the light, headed for the graded fire road. Marco was crying on the floor of the truck. Tess had both hands on his shoulder, and she was telling him the same thing over and over. "We are out. We are out. We are out." We got up onto the ridge where the graded road ran, and I tried the radio again, and this time it caught. I raised the district on the repeater, and I gave them our location and told them I had an injured man and needed an ambulance to the trailhead and the sheriff to meet us. And I told them, and I remember my voice doing something strange when I said it. There were people living back in the canyon. We had been attacked. I had struck one of them with the truck, and he was down on the road, and I did not know if he was alive. Saying it out loud on the radio made it real in a way it had not been yet. The dispatcher made me say the last part twice. We met the ambulance at the trailhead in full dark. Marco had a broken shoulder blade, 2 cracked ribs, and a tear in the muscle that took 2 surgeries and most of a year to come back from. He kept the arm. He kept the leg, too. I bring it up because for a stretch at the county hospital they were worried about a clot in the leg from the way he had been wedged on the floor of the truck. That is the wound this whole thing turns on. The leg. The thing that nearly cost him. He is fine now. He does not run a saw with that arm the way he used to. He still gives me grief about my taste in energy bars, and I let him have every bit of it. I owe him every hard time he ever wants to give me. The sheriff office did not go up the canyon that night. You do not put deputies on a 2-mile washed-out road, in the dark, into a place you have just been told is full of people who attack vehicles. They went in 3 days later, with a lot of people, in daylight. They found the man I hit. He was dead. He had been dragged off the road and laid out under one of the big oaks, and covered over with a kind of tarp made of stitched hides. The deputy who walked me through it later said it looked like somebody had stayed with him for a while before he went. That detail has never once left me. I did a thing I had to do to get Marco out, and I would do it again. The people I did it to grieved that man the way anybody grieves. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I stopped trying a long time ago to make them not be. They took one person into custody, the kid, the one with the pipe who had hesitated in the road. He was sitting on the porch step of the house when they came up, like he had been waiting for them. And he did not run, and he did not fight, and they took him in. The others were gone. The house had been emptied of anything that mattered. There had been 4 generations of living up in that canyon. The sheriff figured there were somewhere between 6 and 9 of them at the end. Most of them walked off into 80,000 acres of country they knew better than any map in the building. As far as I ever heard, they were never found. The kid would not say much of anything. They could not even settle on how old he was. I did not learn what they were until that winter, and I did not learn it from the sheriff. There was a woman named Esther Vall who had taught grade school down in the valley for 35 years before she retired. Somebody at the district said that if anybody knew the old families of those hills, it was her. So I drove down and sat in her kitchen one afternoon because I could not stop turning it over. She made tea, and she did not act surprised that I had come. She said she had wondered, when she heard the news, whether somebody would. She told me the canyon I drove into was the old Marwood claim. A family named Marwood had patented it back in the 1880s, in the Cinnabar days, when men chased mercury all through the Diablo Range. When the mercury played out and the ranches sold off, and the state made a park out of everything around them, the Marwoods just did not leave. They held the deed, Nobody could make them go, and over 4 generations they stopped coming down at all. The kids she taught in the 1960s used to dare each other to go up toward the Marwood Gate, and never did. She said she could think of more than 12 people over the years, hunters and hikers and a county surveyor one time, who went up that drainage and did not come back. Everybody in the valley knew not to go, she said, because you cannot prove a canyon eats people. You can only notice that it does. She said the name the way you would say any old family name, because to her that is all it was. Marco asked me once while he was healing up whether I thought there were still people up that canyon. I told him I did not know. The honest answer is that 80,000 acres is a lot of country, and the ones who walked off knew every fold of it. I closed that gate behind us from the inside like a fool. I do not have it in me to go find out. The gate is gone now. We tore it off the post going through. But the sign is still up there, leaned against the fence post, the homemade one. I saw it in a photograph in the case file. White paint gone gray, and under the no trespassing, in the same hand, it still says, "This means you." In 2006, in a hilltop orchard south of Wolcott, in Wayne County, New York, a frost protection contractor was holding a hard frost off the apple bloom when something came up out of a drainage ditch and put one of his crew on the ground with a leg laid open to the bone. Around the time the thermometer bottomed out, the dog quit barking down in the low ground and never came back. Then he found the marks. 4 lines raked down a fan tower's steel, deep enough to curl the metal, higher than a bear could reach. The old farm families up there had a word for what came down out of the orchard hollows in a killing frost. They called it the Onaway. Most of them had stopped believing in it a long time ago. If you have ever stood alone in an open field on a cold, clear night, you have felt something settle into the dark just past your light. You understand why he stopped where he stood. It did not rush them like a startled bear. It worked the rouse. It cut the grower off from his truck, broke his hand, and pushed all 3 of them back against a concrete building with their backs to a steel door. There was no phone signal up on that hill, and no one coming. Then it began taking the door apart. It worked an arm through the gap above the latch and took hold of the helper's leg. From a foot away, he drove a pry bar into it as hard as he could swing. The worst of it had not even started yet. You're not going to want to miss a single word of this one. What follows is the survivor's own account. Real quick before we start. If true horror is your thing, hit subscribe and like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, let's begin. My name is Russ Bowerman, and back in the spring of 2006, I was running frost machines on a hilltop orchard south of Wolcott, up in Wayne County, New York. I'd been doing frost protection going on 20 years by then, which is a strange way to make a living when you really sit and think about it. Apple growers pay a man to keep their trees from freezing on the 4 or 5 worst nights of the spring. The rest of the year, you barely exist to them. That April, the bloom came early, and the forecast called for a hard radiation frost. That's the still clear kind that pools down in the low ground and kills a crop in one night. So half the county was up. I had 2 men with me on that block. The grower himself, Lon Tesmer, whose family had owned that hilltop since before anybody could remember, and my helper, Pete Hagedorn. We had the wind machines turning by the time the cold really started dropping. Big steel fans up on towers, the kind that pull the warmer air down out of the layer that sits above an orchard on a still night. Lon had his oil heaters going too, the little smudge burners down between the trees. The whole top of that hill smelled like diesel and cold mud and apple blossom all at once. Pete was running the little utility cart down the rows, topping off the heaters. I was up by the main tower with my eyes on the thermometer. That was about when Lon's dog started in. It was a good dog. A stock dog, black and white, never barked at nothing. The kind that just rode around in the truck and looked at you. It got going down at the bottom of the orchard where the ground drops off into the drainage, this hard, steady barking, and then it just stopped. Not trailed off. Stopped. Lon called for it, and nothing came. I still remember him standing there with his coffee in his hand, hollering that dog's name down into the black, and not even an echo coming back. I told him it probably treed a raccoon. He said his dog didn't tree raccoons. That was the first thing that was wrong, and I waved it off, because that is what you do on a frost night. You have one job, and you keep your eyes on the number. I should explain what those nights are actually like, because if you have never sat one out, you would picture something peaceful, and it is the opposite of that. A radiation frost happens on a clear, dead still night. All the heat the ground soaked up during the day just radiates straight back up into the sky. There is no wind to stir things, so the cold settles into the low spots like water finding a basin. The fans fight that. They reach up into the warmer air sitting 40 or 50 feet over the trees and drag it down across the bloom. You start them around 34 degrees, and you watch, and you pray. A hard frost on open king bloom can take a man's entire year in about 2 hours. Lon had borrowed against that block. So, no, none of us were going anywhere. That's the part the deputies could not get their heads around afterward, when they kept asking why we did not just leave. You do not leave. The crop is the whole year. The crop is the mortgage. That orchard had been apple ground for a long time, longer than the trees standing on it, and Lon's people had been on that hill since the 1800s. I mention that because it matters to how the night ended, though I did not know it yet. The land falls away on the north side of that block into a wet hollow. It has never been any good for anything. Too low and too cold, full of cattail and black muck. The cold rolls down off the high ground into that hollow and just sits there. The old-timers around Wolcott left the low orchards alone. There were blocks down in those hollows that nobody had pruned in 50 years, gone wild and half dead. I always figured that was just because the frost made them a bad bet. I figured a lot of things that night that turned out to be wrong. After the dog went quiet, the air down at the bottom of the orchard started to smell wrong. I want to be careful how I tell this part. It is easy to make it sound stranger than it was in the moment. It smelled like a downed power line, like cut copper sort of, with something scorched underneath it, and a sourness over the top. It was coming up the slope on the cold draft, the same way the cold itself comes up a slope, in a slow, steady pour. I figured a transformer had let go on the pole line out along the road. Then the far fan, the one nearest the drainage, started cutting out. It would wind down and catch, wind down and catch, like something heavy was leaning into the blade and then letting off. Those fans do not do that. They run flat and steady all night, or they throw a belt and quit for good. But they do not breathe like that. I got Pete on the two-way and told him to swing down and have a look. That right there was the first real mistake I made. I sent him down to the bottom of that hill by himself. He keyed the radio maybe a minute later, and I could not make out the words. Just his voice gone high and fast, and the cart engine under it, and then the cart engine cutting out too. I went down the rows at a dead run, which at 50 is more of a hard stumble than a run. The heaters threw that low orange light up under the trees, so the whole orchard was moving shadows around me. I found the cart sideways across a row with one wheel still spinning. Pete was maybe 30 feet off it, on his back in the wet grass between two trees, scrabbling backward with his heels and not making any sound at all. And there was something standing over the cart. I only ever saw it in pieces. That is the honest truth of it, and I have made my peace with it. You do not get a clean look at a thing like that in heater light at the bottom of a hill. What I got was a wet shine, the way a salamander shines, like something that had just come up out of the muck, and one long arm that came down off a high shoulder and reached past where a knee ought to be. It stood about as tall as me, but it was put together wrong. Narrow through the body and far too long in the arms, and the head sat low and forward off the shoulders. The light caught its eyes once and threw it back flat and coppery green, set low and too wide apart on that low head. And it was making a sound I had never heard before and have never heard since. A fast, dry ticking down in its chest, like a gearbox run dry, with a wet creak under it, like a rope pulled tight. It was watching Pete. Then it turned that low head and watched me, and the ticking changed. I did the only thing my body knew how to do. I grabbed Pete by the collar of his coat, the canvas one, the tan one he wore every single night, and hauled. He came up off the ground and we went up that row together, both of us falling and getting up. I did not look back because I could hear it behind us. Not running exactly. A long loping shuffle, fast, going up onto two legs and then dropping onto all of them and coming on. We came out at the top into the heater light and the noise of the main fan, and it broke off. It just peeled away into the dark down a row. I stood there with my hands on my knees pulling cold air, and Pete was saying something over and over, and it took me a second to make it out. He was saying, "That's not a bear, Russ. That's not a bear. That's not a bear." Now, Pete was a talker on a good day. He was the kind of man who narrated his own life out loud whether you were listening or not. I had spent a lot of frost nights wishing he would just hush for 10 minutes. So when Pete went quiet, it scared me worse than anything down in the rows. He sat down hard in the wet grass by the tower and just stopped talking. Lon came over with the rifle out of his truck, his deer rifle. The three of us stood there in a little knot of orange light. I told him what I saw, and I watched him decide not to believe me. I don't blame him. If a man had stood there and told me what I was telling Lon, I would have decided not to believe him too. He said it was a bear come up out of the swamp early, hungry after the winter. We would keep the lights and the noise up, and it would stay off. And we still had a crop to save. And the thing is, that was not a crazy plan. On any other night in my whole life, that would have been the right call. You keep the fire and the engines going, and a big bear keeps its distance. So we stayed. We split up to keep the heaters fed, because the temperature was still falling and the bloom was still dying with every degree, and we stayed. That was the second mistake, and it was mine as much as Lon's, and I have gone over it 10,000 times since. For a while, a long while, nothing happened. And that quiet was its own kind of awful, because the smell did not leave and the dog did not come back. Once in a while, a heater down the rows would just go dark, like something had stepped on it and snuffed it. After a bit, I went and found the fan tower it had clawed. 4 lines down the leg of that tower, in the galvanized steel, peeled up at the edges like somebody had run a forklift tine down it. The lowest of the 4 was higher than the top of my head. I put my hand flat on the metal, and the cold of it went straight up my arm. And I understood finally, all the way down to the bottom of me, that we should already have been in the trucks and gone. I turned to go tell Lon. And that was when I figured out what it had been doing in all that quiet, because the smell was not coming up from the drainage anymore. It was coming from up the hill, from up between us and the trucks. It had moved up the slope in the dark while we tended fire. It had put itself between the 3 of us and the only way off that hilltop. And it had done all of it without making one sound. I do not know how to describe what it is like to stand in an open field and understand that a thing has been thinking about you. We came back together at the head of the rows, all 3 of us, drawn in tight against each other. It was the way deer pull in when the dogs are working them. I could hear it out past the edge of the light, not on the roadside. That was the part that took the legs out from under me once I understood it. The roadside was wide open, and it had left it open. The truck was sitting right there with the rifle locked in the cab, 50 yards of clear grass away. It wanted us to run for that truck. The 2 sides I could not see, the downslope and the dark below the tree line, were where it was. And the one clear path it had left for us was the one it was pushing us toward. Every part of me wanted to break for it anyway. Lon broke for it. I want to be fair to the man. He was running for that rifle to put himself between it and us. but he broke for the truck, and it came up the row at him. I have never in my life seen anything cover ground like that. It came out of the dark, low and long, and it was on him at the truck before he got the door open. It took him by the hand that was reaching for the door handle, and I heard it break. I heard the actual sound of it. Lon went down screaming against the side of the truck with it standing over him, and it had his whole arm now, and it started to pull. And Pete, who earlier had been frozen flat on his back in the grass, grabbed a heater up off the ground, one of the lit oil burners, by its hot frame, and he threw it. It came apart against the thing's shoulder, and the burning oil ran down its back. It let go of Lon and went sideways into the dark, fast. The ticking in its chest had gone up into something I felt in my back teeth. We got Lon up between us. His hand was wrong, the fingers folded the wrong way, and the blood was coming dark in that orange light. We ran him the only direction that was left to run, which was away from the trucks. Down toward the cinder block building at the low edge of the orchard, where Lon kept his sprayer and his pump. It was a squat, concrete building. No windows, one steel door, the kind of place a man puts a sprayer and a pump so they will not freeze and burst over the winter. We got Lon through the door, and Pete got it shut behind us. I threw the inside bar across it, an old length of steel pipe that dropped into 2 welded brackets. For 1 second, the 3 of us stood in the pure dark in there, breathing, and I thought, all right. Concrete walls, steel door, no windows, it cannot get in here. I got my flashlight going. Lon was down against the sprayer tank, holding his ruined hand against his chest, and his face had gone the color of ash. Pete had a gash down his own forearm he did not even seem to know he had. I started wrapping Lon's hand with a shop rag off the bench, and that was when the first hit came against the door. It was not a scratch, and it was not a knock. It was a full body hit, the whole weight of the thing slamming into that steel door at once. The door jumped in the frame. The bar held, but the brackets groaned, and a fine rain of concrete dust came down off the wall where the frame was anchored into the block. Then it hit it again. I had Lon's blood slick on both hands, and a flashlight clamped in my teeth. I put my shoulder against that door, and Pete put his against it, and the 2 of us held it while it threw itself into the far side. You could feel the cold coming off it right through the steel, and you could hear it breathing now, this wet bellows sound right at the gap above the latch, and that ticking, fast and dry and patient. Lon was praying behind us, not loud, just steady, the words all running together into each other. And then it stopped. It just stopped, all at once, and the quiet came down so hard it hurt my ears. We stood against that door a long time waiting on the next hit, and the next hit did not come. I don't know how long. A while. Long enough that my legs started to shake from bracing the door. Pete slid down to sit against it, and I let myself start to believe the thing had gone. I picked up the 2-way and tried Lon's wife down at the house, and got nothing but the static you get in those hills. I tried my cell phone and watched it search for a signal it was never going to find out there. Then I set it down. I remember the sky through the gap under the door looked maybe a shade gray. I told them it would be light soon, and when it was light, it would be over. That is the kind of thing a person says, and I half believed it myself. Lon had stopped praying and started shivering hard, going down into shock, and I got my own coat off and put it over him. Pete had gone very quiet against the door. I asked him how his arm was, and he said, "It's fine, doesn't even hurt," which is exactly what a man says when something is very much not fine. And out in the dark, soft, from somewhere down the rows, the ticking started up again. And then a sound came in under it that put the hair up on the whole length of my body. It was the sound of the far fan winding down and catching, winding down and catching. Except the far fan had thrown its belt a while back and was not turning at all. It had learned the sound. I do not know any other way to put it that is honest. It had stood out there next to that fan earlier in the night, listening to it cut out and catch, cut out and catch. And now it was making the sound itself, down in its chest. It was using that sound to come up the hill on us. We had spent the whole first half of the night training ourselves not to be afraid of that exact sound. I have thought about that more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life since. Not how strong it was, not how fast. That it was smart enough to find the one sound we had taught ourselves to ignore and then wear it like a coat to get close. The second time it came at the door, it did not try to break the door. It went for the frame, and I felt the difference right away. It worked that long forearm into the gap above the latch, in past where a man's elbow would be. It took hold of the edge of the door from the inside, and it pulled. The welded brackets that held my bar started to walk out of the concrete, a hair at a time. I got both hands on the bar, trying to keep it seated. The steel of the door edge was peeling back where the thing had hold of it. I was looking at the arm from a foot away in the flashlight, this wet, dark thing strung with cord under the skin. The hand on the end of it was too long, the fingers folding back the way no hand should fold. And the cut copper and scorched smell came off it so thick I could taste metal at the back of my mouth. Pete reached past me to try to shove the arm back out through the gap with both hands. He should not have done that. I've never told his family this part the way it actually happened, and I'm not going to start now. But he reached for the arm, and the hand came off the door and took him instead. It got him by the lower leg, below the knee, and it pulled. Pete went down hard onto his back and slid toward that gap, his fingers clawing at the smooth concrete with nothing on it to hold, and the leg of his jeans went dark all at once. I dropped the bar and got him under the arms and pulled the other way. For a few seconds, it was just me and that thing, pulling Pete between us through 6 inches of bent steel. I could hear what was happening to his leg in that gap, the sound of it. And Pete was screaming in a way I have never been able to get out of my head. Lon got up off the floor on his one good hand and got hold of Pete's belt. The two of us hauled, and the thing hauled, and the door frame screamed against its anchors. I jammed a knee against the sprayer tank and put everything I had left in me into one pull. And then the arm let off Pete's leg for half a second, the way you reset your grip on something heavy. And in that half second, I got him back. The 3 of us went over backward into the dark of the building with Pete on top of us. His leg was open from the knee down by the knife of that bent steel and by whatever else had hold of him. The meat of the calf was laid open to the white of it, a long flap of him hanging loose, and the blood went out fast and dark across the concrete floor. The arm was still in the gap, and it had stopped looking for the bar. It was looking for me. I came up off that floor with the pry bar in both hands. Before I could get the swing started, the hand came off the door and caught me. The long fingers raked down across my left shoulder and the back of my shoulder blade. They drove me sideways into the sprayer tank, hard enough to knock the wind clean out of me. I felt the skin of my back open up under it, and felt my own blood go warm down inside my shirt. Something in my left arm quit working right from that second on. The top of my head was laid open too where it had clipped me going by, and the blood started running down into my left eye. But the hand had come off the door to get me, which meant that for 1 second it was not braced against anything. I got the bar up in my good hand and the heel of my off hand. I drove the flat end of it into the arm where the forearm met the wrist. I drove it with everything I had left in me. I felt it go in and grind against something hard underneath. The thing made a sound I never want to hear again, and the arm whipped back out through the gap. And on the end of that bar, when I pulled it back into the light, there was blood. Dark, near black, thick as syrup. And a smell came off it like a struck match in a wet cellar. It bled. I keep coming back to that, all these years. Whatever it was, it bled, and it could be hurt, and when it pulled back off the door this time, it was favoring that side. I could hear it in how it moved off, the long lope gone lopsided and dragging. But it did not leave. It went around the building, along the long wall, that ticking low and ragged now and wet. And then we heard it up over our heads. It had gotten up on the roof. That building had a corrugated steel roof on wood purlins. It had gone up the corner of the block wall somehow, up onto the steel. It started working at the roof above us, and dust and bits of old rotted insulation came sifting down through the flashlight beam, and Pete was bleeding out on the floor under all of it. I am not a doctor. By then my left arm was hanging mostly dead at my side. The blood off my scalp kept sheeting down into my left eye, so I was working at it half blind. But I had a tourniquet in my head from 100 farm safety talks. I had a length of that shop rag and a screwdriver out of the toolbox bolted to the wall. I got the rag high up on Pete's thigh and twisted the screwdriver into it with my good hand. I kept twisting until the dark pulse coming up out of his leg slowed down and went lazy. Pete was gray and going quiet. I kept slapping the side of his face with my good hand and telling him to talk to me. You never shut up. Talk to me now. Tell me about anything. And he looked up at me and he asked me if I had seen his boot. The thing had pulled his boot clean off his foot when it took his leg. And that small thing, that he was lying there opened up and bleeding out on a concrete floor, and what he was worried about was his boot. That almost finished me right there. Lon was working the two-way with his good hand, just saying the same words over and over into the static, that they needed help up at the orchard, that men were hurt. And somewhere down at the house, his wife must have finally caught a word of it on the bass set. The static broke open once, and a voice came through, and was gone again. Up on the roof, it was tearing at a seam now, peeling the steel back the same way it had peeled the door. A long strip of gray sky opened up over us, and then the arm came down through it. It came down through the roof, feeling for us in the dark, and it could not quite reach the floor. I got down under the far end of the building and dragged Pete up against my chest with my one good arm. Lon pressed in tight beside me. We put our backs into the one corner where the two walls met, the one place that arm could not reach. I watched it sweep back and forth across that black room, a foot off the floor, slow and patient, the long fingers spread. The ticking in its chest had gone way down and even, and the gray of the open sky behind it was getting paler by the minute. It knew we were in the corner. It was just a question of reach. It pulled itself half down through the hole in the roof to reach in further. I could see the low, wide head come through into the flashlight, those flat, coppery eyes finding the three of us in the corner. The seam of its mouth came open the wrong way, lengthwise down the front of the face instead of side to side. And that is the last clear picture I carry of it. That opening face coming down through a torn roof at first light, reaching for us, a foot short and closing. And then the light came up over the hill. Real light, the flat gray that comes right before the sun. The diesel smoke off all those heaters was hanging low in a sheet across the whole orchard. And down at the bottom of the lane there were headlights coming up fast. Lon's wife and 2 deputies and the volunteer ambulance crew out of town. And the thing up in the roof went still. It hung there a second in the hole with the new light coming up on it. For the first time all night, I saw it want to be somewhere else. It pulled itself back up through the roof. I heard it go off the back of the building and hit the ground. I heard it go off down through the orchard the way it had come up, fast and lopsided and low. It went down the rows toward the drainage and the wet hollow below it. It did not make the fan sound this time. It did not make any sound at all, except the weight of it moving away from us. And then it was gone down into the low ground, where the cold still sat. The trucks were coming up the lane, and Pete was still breathing under my hands. The deputies found the marks on the fan tower, and the marks down the door, and the 2 kinds of blood, Pete's red and the near black off my pry bar. They had no idea on this earth what to make of any of it. And on the report they wrote down bear, because that is the word that fits in the box on the form. Pete lived. He lost a good deal of that leg below the knee, and he gets around on a cane now. He does not talk near as much as he used to, which is the part I would give the most to undo. Lon's hand healed up crooked and stiff, and the crop froze solid that night, while the three of us were shut in that building, every blossom on that block. So it all came to nothing in the end, the staying, the whole reason we had not just gotten in the trucks and left. I did not sleep much for a long time after that spring. A few days later, I called my mother. She is up in her 80s now, and grew up on a farm 2 valleys over from that one. I did not set out to tell her any of it, but it came out of me anyway. Then I told her about the wet, long-armed thing that came up out of the orchard hollow in the frost, and the sound it made down in its chest. She went quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she told me her grandfather had a word for it. He used to warn them, when she was a girl, to stay up out of the low orchards on the hard frost nights in the spring. He warned them because of the thing that came up out of those hollows, and he called it the Onaway. It was an old word, she said, older than the families, from the people who had the land before any of the orchards were planted. What the old grandfathers believed was that it did not belong here at all. They believed it had come down out of the sky a long time ago and gotten itself stuck in the cold, low ground, and that it only ever came up on the killing frosts, the same few nights of the spring. The families had lost 6 or 7 people to it over the years, she said, and a fair amount of stock. And after a while, everybody had just slowly stopped believing in it, the way people do. Lon called me about a week after that. He had not been able to bring himself to say it before, he told me, because of Pete. The morning after, once it got light enough to see, he had gone down to lock up the building, and he had found the dog. It was laid out on the concrete step in front of the steel door, on its side, facing the door, set down careful, not a single mark on it anywhere. It had been there all night, the whole time the 3 of us were shut up inside, right on the other side of the steel. He buried it up at the top of the hill, where the trees had already died from the frost, and he never planted that block again. In August 2002, in a hardwood ridge cove off Sweetwater Creek in Tishomingo County, Mississippi, a 47-year-old state archaeology field surveyor was pulled out of a tree platform by something that came down through the canopy behind him. It hit him from above, tore his collarbone open, and rode him to the ground hard enough to crack the ladder frame on its way past. What got him was tall and worked the high branches like a climber who never came down. It had already killed one of the county's coon dogs that summer. It had stripped bark from a stand of beech in a long descending spiral that no one in the district had a word for. He fought it on the ground in the laurel slick beside the creek for what he later said was about 4 minutes. His 2 crew members were a mile back at the trucks by then, hauling the heavy stadia rod up the cove road. He was alone with what came out of the timber. It got its hands on him twice. It opened the meat on his thigh. It chased him uphill at a speed he could not believe. If you have ever climbed into a deer stand at last light and felt something move in the canopy above you that should not be moving that high, you already know the cold I am talking about. That is the cold that put him into that fight. Locals in the Tombigbee Hills had been calling it the Lank since the 1880s. That was when a logging crew working the second cut out of a camp on Bear Creek started losing men. The final tally was 21. The county search and rescue captain knew the name. An old forester at the district office knew it too. His account begins now. Before the story starts, one small ask. If these keep you up at night in the best way, subscribe, drop a like, and send it to a fellow horror fan. And tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Thanks for being here. Now, let's get into it. My name is Wilbur Tackett, and what I am about to lay out for you happened to me in August of 2002, in a stretch of Hardwood Ridge Cove country in Tishomingo County, Mississippi. I had been a field archaeologist with the State Department for going on 22 years by then. Survey work mostly. Tracts of land somebody wanted to log, or build a road through, or run a power line across. My job was to walk the ground, find what was on it, and write up a report. I worked alone a lot of years, but on that job I had 2 people with me. One was a grad student from the state university named Maddox Yardley, a kid in his middle 20s who couldn't stop talking and never figured out which way was north. Maddox had spent the last 3 summers digging on coastal native sites with a professor he loved. He was on this job because the professor had bumped him to me for the survey work credit. The other was Bishop Olinger, a county road engineer who was there because the road realignment paying for the survey was his project. Bishop was in his 50s, built like a man who had spent his whole adult life on his feet, and he didn't say much. I liked him for that. The job was a Phase 2 site survey on a tract of cove country in northeast Mississippi, off a fork of Sweetwater Creek. The state had records of a tenant farmstead there from the 1880s, and the county wanted to widen a gravel road right through the middle of it. So they paid us to come dig, photograph, and write up what was there before the dozers got it. The whole job was supposed to take 6 days. The first wrong thing happened on day 2. I was walking a transect about 30 yards above the main farmstead pad, looking for outbuilding scatter. Old plowshares, broken bottle glass, anything to show me how big the working operation had been. Instead, I found a beech tree with all the bark stripped off it in a spiral. It started about 12 feet up the trunk and came down to about 4 feet off the ground. The strips were maybe 1.5 inches wide, and they ran a clean spiral all the way around, like a barber's pole that somebody had wound by hand. The wood underneath was still wet. Whatever did it had done it that week. I called Maddox over. He stared at it for a minute and said, "That looks like bear." I told him no. Bear's claw straight down, bear's tear. This was a spiral, and a careful one. We took 4 photos and moved on. I wrote it up in my field notebook as one line: anomalous bark strip, beech, spiral pattern, no identified cause. That is the line that bothered me later. That evening we drove back to where we were staying. It was a 2-room hunting cabin half a mile up a gravel cut on a piece of property owned by an old man named Carlin Hodge. Carlin was somewhere north of 70 by then and didn't hunt himself anymore, but he kept the cabin rented out to surveyors and deer hunters and the occasional fishing party. He had been a logger his whole working life until his hip went bad. I had shaken his hand when we showed up. He had said one full sentence to me, which was, "If you hear anything at night up here, you stay inside until daylight." I had said all right. I figured he meant black bear. Carlin nodded once and went back into his house, and that was the most we had talked. When Bishop parked the truck that evening, he stopped before he got out and walked around to the driver's side and crouched. I asked him what he was looking at, and he didn't answer for a minute. Then he said, "Come see this." There were 3 long scratches running across the rocker panel of his truck. They started about 8 inches off the ground and ran up to about 18 inches and ended on the rear door. It was like something had reached down and dragged its hand sideways while standing taller than the truck. "Bear stood up on it," Bishop said. I said maybe. But a bear standing up doesn't reach down to scratch. A bear standing up reaches across. These scratches reached down. Bishop ran his thumb in one of the grooves and said, "Long fingers." That was all he said about it. The cabin had a metal porch roof that wrapped around the front of it. Sometime after midnight that night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first. A weight moving across the metal. Not the way a coon moves on metal. All stop and go and scrabble. This was slow, steady. Long pulls of weight. The sound a man makes if he is trying to be quiet. I lay there in the dark and listened. After what felt like a long time, it went off the porch roof and into the gutter, and then I didn't hear it anymore. Maddox was in the bunk above me. I heard him whisper down, "Did you hear that?" I told him I heard it. He asked what it was, and I told him I didn't know. He asked if we should look out. I told him no. Neither of us slept much the rest of that night. In the morning, the porch roof had what looked like 2 long parallel smear marks in the dew that had collected on the metal. Like something with bare, wet feet had walked across it. I told myself it was a coon, and I told Maddox the same. Bishop never even came outside that morning. He just got in his truck and we followed him to the site. Day 3 was when we found the dog. We had parked at the same pull-off as the day before. The road into the site was a logging spur, washed out in places, narrow. We were maybe 200 yards from the pull-off, walking in single file with Maddox in front because he was carrying the rod. He stopped so suddenly, Bishop almost walked into him. There was a hickory tree maybe 15 feet off the trail. In the first fork of the tree, about 10 feet off the ground, was a coon dog. A young red bone, judging by the color. It was hung up in the fork by what looked like the back of its skull, and the chest had been opened and the inside of it was gone. Bishop took a long, slow breath through his nose. He said, "That is Lester Pinckney's dog. Lester lives 3 miles down the road. That dog was named Trace." Maddox sat down on his pack right there in the middle of the trail. He did not throw up, but I could tell he wanted to. He is a city kid. He had never seen something like that. I asked Bishop how a dog gets up in a fork that high. Bishop did not answer me. He just stood there with his hands on his hips, looking up at the dog, looking around at the tree, looking at the ground. There were no claw marks on the trunk. The dog had not climbed. Something had put it there. After a while, Bishop said, "I'll call Lester after work. We'll come back and get it down." We walked the rest of the way to the site without talking. I should say something here about how I rationalized it at the time. I told myself a big cat, a panther. There were still rumors of panthers in that part of the state, even though officially they were not there anymore. A panther could carry a dog up into a tree and cache it. That is what cats do. They cache. I said all this to Maddox out loud while we were setting up the total station that morning, mostly to keep him from going to pieces. He nodded a lot. I don't think he believed me. I'm not sure I did either. We worked through the morning. The site was a small thing. A scatter of foundation stones for what had been a 2-room house, a collapsed root cellar, a privy pit, a kitchen midden, and about 30 yards north, the remains of a smokehouse. Iron hardware was scattered through the leaf litter where the smokehouse had been. Hinges, a door latch, a meat hook. I found the meat hook just before noon. It was a homemade thing, forged by hand, with a curve about 6 inches long and a shaft that ended in a flat tab. The kind of hook a tenant farmer would have hammered out himself in a coal forge to hang hog quarters from. I tagged it, photographed it, bagged it, and put it in the field box. After lunch, Maddox and Bishop drove out to the parts store in town to get a new battery for the total station, which had been losing charge all morning. I stayed at the site to keep working the smokehouse area. I told them I would be fine, and I told myself I would be fine. For a while, I was fine. I was on my knees in the leaf duff, sifting, troweling, bagging. I had my headphones in, but only in one ear, because in the woods, you always keep one ear out. That is an old habit. The second ear is what saved me, I think. I heard a sound up in the canopy that I could not place. Not a bird, and not the wind. A short scrape, like cloth on bark, maybe 40 feet up and maybe 30 feet behind me. I sat back on my heels and looked up. I couldn't see anything. The canopy was dense. August leaves, full green, no light getting through in patches. I sat there for a long time staring straight up. After a bit, a single beech leaf came drifting down. Then another one. From a part of the canopy where there was no wind that I could feel on the ground. I told myself a roosting wild turkey. They do that sometimes. They roost up high and shift their weight, and you hear it and you don't see them. I put both headphones in. I did not turn around. I worked the leaf duff for a while longer. Then I packed my field box and walked back to the road and waited at the pull-off for Maddox and Bishop to come back. I did not want to be alone there anymore. I did not tell them about it. I felt stupid. I had been a field archaeologist for 22 years, and I had never asked anybody to babysit me before. So I did not ask. That night at the cabin, Carlin's hounds went quiet for the first time since we had arrived. Carlin kept 4 dogs in a kennel behind his house. They were friendly dogs, but loud. They barked at squirrels, at headlights, at each other, at whatever wind came down the cove. We had been hearing them constantly the whole 3 nights we had been there. That night they stopped at full dark and they stayed stopped. No barking, no shifting around, nothing. Like all 4 of them were holding their breath at once. Some time later, I don't know how long, there was a single sound against the back wall of the cabin. One sharp tap, low, about waist height, on the planking. Not a knock. A tap. Like somebody had touched the wall once with the end of a finger. Bishop, who had not said a word since we had come back inside, opened his eyes and looked at me across the room. He did not move. After a minute, he said very quietly, "Stay where you are." We stayed where we were. The dogs were silent for what must have been a long time. Then, all 4 of them at once, they started barking again. They barked for a few minutes and then settled down. The next morning, the kennel had fresh scratch marks on the outside of the chain link, like something had reached through. The dogs were fine. I told myself, a black bear. That is what I kept telling myself. Day 4. We came out to find Bishop's truck door standing open in the carport. He had locked it the night before. He showed me the keys still in his pocket. The driver's door was open about 6 inches. Nothing in the cab was missing. Bishop's clipboard was on the seat where he had left it. His thermos was in the cup holder. The cab smelled like wet bark. I'm going to say that part again because it took me a while to put words to it at the time. The whole inside of the truck smelled like the underside of a hardwood log that has been laying out in a rainy creek bottom for a week. Wet bark. Tannin. A little bit like cold leaves that have started to break down. Something living lived in that smell. Bishop sat in the driver's seat for a minute breathing it. Then he got out and walked around to the bed of the truck. He stood there looking out across the field, with his back to us, and I saw his shoulders go up and down once. He was working something out. He turned around and walked back to me and said, "We are done here Friday no matter what. I am not staying past Friday." I said, "All right." I asked him if we should pull the survey early. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "We've got one more good day. We can finish on day 5 if we push it. After that, we leave whether we are done or not." That was the agreement. Day 5 was Friday. We worked through the day. Maddox and I finished mapping the kitchen midden and most of the privy pit. Bishop walked the road center line with his measuring wheel for the road project and kept his head on a swivel the whole time. I noticed because I was watching him. Coming out of the site in the late afternoon, we found 3 more stripped trees, a young red oak, another beech, and a sweet gum. All of them had the same spiral, same width of strip, same range, 12 feet down to 4 feet. They were in a rough line about 200 yards apart, running along the upper rim of the cove. It took me a minute to see what I was looking at. The trees were spaced out like a property line, like somebody had marked off the edge of a territory. Maddox saw it too. He said, "That's a boundary." I said it might be. He said, "Whose?" I didn't have an answer for him. That evening, we went down the road to Carlin's house instead of going straight to the cabin. I knocked on his screen door. He came out wiping his hands on a rag and stood on the porch and waited for me to talk. I told him what we had found. The bark spirals, the dog, the scratches on the truck, the smell in the cab. I did not tell him about the canopy because I still had not told anybody about the canopy. He listened all the way through. He did not ask any questions. When I was done, he looked at me for a long while, and then he looked past me at the woods up the cove, and then he said one thing. He said, "You boys clear out of that cove tomorrow." I asked him what was in there. He said, "There has always been something in there. Old logging boys had a word for it." He stopped. He looked at his porch boards. He said, "I am not going to put the word in my mouth. You go on home tomorrow night and don't come back." I asked him again. He shook his head. He said, "Some words you say, you call the thing." Then he went inside and shut the door. On Friday morning, we had a conversation at the cabin. Bishop wanted to pull out. He kept saying we had enough data. I did not disagree with that. but I told him the smokehouse area still needed about 3 hours of careful work, and I wanted to get it done before the dozers came. I had spent my whole career writing reports about sites that were 80% excavated because somebody pulled the funding before the last 20% got done. I did not want this one on my desk for the next 5 years. Bishop did not like it, but he agreed. The compromise was this. We would work the morning. Then Bishop and Maddox would hike back to the trucks, drive into town, and pick up a few things we needed for closing out the site. They would come back for me by 4 in the afternoon. I would finish the smokehouse alone. I had my belt knife and my chainsaw kit in case I needed to clear brush. I had a road flare in my pack. I had the little flip phone I carried that had no signal in the cove but worked sometimes from the high ridge above it. I told Bishop I would be fine for 2 hours alone. I want to put this on the record clearly. Bishop did not want to leave me there. Bishop offered 3 separate times to send Maddox alone and stay with me. I told him no every time, because I am the senior person on these jobs, and that is how it goes. I sent him to town. That was on me. I sent Maddox and Bishop back to the trucks just after midday. I watched them go up the Cove Road carrying the heavy stadia rod between them like 2 men carrying a coffin. Then I went back into the smokehouse pad to work. The air in the cove that afternoon was thick the way Mississippi August air gets thick. Heat without any wind. The cicadas were loud above me and the cicadas were loud below me, all the way up and all the way down the cove. I worked on my knees in the leaf duff, sifting, troweling, bagging. I wrote in my notebook with a pencil because pens do not write on field paper that has been damp. For a while, I was all right. I had myself convinced. I had built a small platform earlier in the week, about 14 feet up in a big white oak at the upper edge of the smokehouse pad, so I could take elevated photos straight down on the iron scatter. I had nailed 4 short pieces of pressure-treated 206 to the trunk as a ladder, and at the top I had lashed a piece of plywood across 2 limbs. It was not much of a platform. It was enough to stand on and shoot photos from. Sometime after I had been alone a while, I climbed up to take the photos. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because the part of me that remembers is not the same part that thinks. The part that thinks has had years to put it in an order. The part that remembers has the order all wrong. I was on the platform, leaning against the trunk, taking photos. I had the camera at my face. I heard the sound I had heard the day before, the cloth on bark sound, and this time it was close. It was close in 2 ways. It was close in distance, and it was close in direction. It was above me and slightly behind me. On the side of the trunk I could not see. I lowered the camera very slowly. I did not turn around. I want to put down here what I was thinking right then, because it matters. I was thinking, if I turn around, I am committing. If I turn around, whatever is up there knows that I know, and whatever is up there has not decided yet what to do with me. So I did not turn around. I stood there with the camera at my hip, and I waited. The sound moved. It moved from above and behind me to above and to my left. It was working around the trunk. I could hear weight settling. Limb cracks, small ones, the kind of thing makes when it is transferring its mass slowly from one branch to another. Whatever it was big enough to make limbs decide whether to hold. It came around in front of me. I am going to tell you what I saw, but I am going to tell it the way I saw it that day, not the way I have rebuilt it since. What I saw was a long, pale arm. Not a man's arm. Too long. Too thin. With too many joints in places where a man does not have joints. The arm was hanging down from a limb about 25 feet over my head. It was holding onto the limb the way a man holds a rail he is about to swing off of. The hand had fingers, but I'm not going to count them because I never got that close a look. Above the arm, in the green of the leaves, I could see the outline of something I could not put a shape to. Long. Folded in on itself the way a long-bodied thing folds in canopy. There were eyes. There were 2 of them. They were dark, and they were sunk, and they were looking at me. They had no shine. They were the color the eyes of a thing have when it does not need light to see you. I want to be honest. I was a 47-year-old man in the woods alone, and I urinated standing up on that platform in front of it. I do not tell people that part. I am telling you that part because it is true. I moved my right hand very slowly to the belt sheath where the knife was. I got my thumb on the snap. I did not unsnap it. I just left my thumb there. The arm extended down, slowly. The shoulder followed. The head came down past the limb. The whole long thing started lowering itself like a man on a rope. That was when I climbed down. Not slowly, as fast as I could on a 4-step ladder of pressure-treated boards. I made it to the 3rd board. It dropped on the platform behind me. The plywood broke in half. The trunk shuddered. I felt the displacement of air on the back of my neck before I felt anything else. Then I felt weight come down on my shoulders and right side. The impact hit me at the angle a man hits the water from a high dive. The next thing I knew was the ground. I hit the ground on my left hip and my left shoulder. The ladder frame had cracked at the 2nd board, and a piece of the broken 2x6 had gone through the meat under my collarbone on the right side. Not the way a bullet goes through, the way a piece of broken wood goes through, ragged and stays in. My right collarbone was broken. I could feel the ends grinding against each other when I tried to breathe. The thing landed somewhere to the left of me. I heard it land. It made almost no sound. A soft compression, like a sandbag. I lay there with my eyes closed. I am not proud of it. I lay there with my eyes closed because of a decision I made in the half-second between hitting the ground and what was about to happen. The only chance I had was to convince it I was already done. It came over to me. I could hear it. It took 3 steps. It was on 2 legs. It put its face down close to mine. I could smell wet bark and tannin and something old underneath both of those, like a creek bottom that has been still for a long time. I could feel breath, cool breath, not warm. It put a hand on my chest. The hand had fingers, and the fingers were long. It did not have claws. It had nails. It pressed on my chest the way a person might press on a thing to see if it gave. I did not give. I did not breathe. It took its hand off. It took my pack strap in one hand, and it pulled. I felt it start to drag me. It was dragging me by the shoulder strap of my pack toward the downhill side of the smokehouse pad. From there, the cove dropped 30 feet through a stand of mountain laurel down to Sweetwater Creek. The pack strap held. The drag pulled at my left armpit. It hurt. It hurt the way being pulled by a tow strap would hurt. My left arm was the only arm I could feel that was not broken or skewered. I was going to be cached. That was the word I had in my head. Cached. Like a cat caches a kill in a tree to come back for later. Whatever this thing was, I was going to be put somewhere it intended to come back for me. I opened my eyes. It was above me, walking backward, dragging me by the strap. Its back was to me. I could see the shape of it from below. Long. Lank. The word came into my head right then. Lank. Just the word, and I am telling you that. I do not know why. I had not heard the word for this thing yet. I would not hear it for 3 more weeks. But the word came into my head looking up at it. I got my left hand to my belt sheath, and I unsnapped the knife. It was a 4-inch fixed-blade carbon steel knife. I had carried that knife on field surveys for 18 years. I had cut probably 4,000 yards of stadia line with it. I had skinned 1 deer with it, badly. I had never put it in anything that was alive and trying. I waited until it was over me. Then I swung straight up. I hit it in the throat. Or I hit it in what the throat would have been on a man. I felt the blade go in deep, and I felt it hit something hard underneath, like cartilage. I felt warm fluid run down my hand. It dropped the strap. It dropped me. It went up. It went up the trunk of the white oak in 2 motions, and then it was gone into the canopy, and there was no sound at all. Not a thrash. Not a cry. It just left. I had about 15 seconds. I ran. I went uphill. Uphill was the only direction that was not Laurel. I ran with one arm pinned against my side and a piece of itsKreature sticking out of my collarbone. I made it maybe 40 yards before I heard it coming back. It was coming from above. It was working the canopy again. It was paralleling me from up there. Then it dropped. Not all the way down. Halfway. It hit a low limb above the trail in front of me. It used the limb to swing down and put a long arm into my chest, and I went over backward into the laurel. That is when it got my thigh. I do not remember the sequence well. I remember the weight of it on me, and I remember the cool breath, and I remember the wet bark smell, and I remember a tearing on the outside of my right thigh where the muscle goes down to the knee. I think it was a hand. I think the nails. I do not know. I got it in the face with my left hand. I got my left thumb into one of the dark, sunken eyes. The thumb went in further than a thumb should go into an eye. It came off of me. I got up. I do not know how. I have replayed that part for years, and I do not know how I got up with what was wrong with me. The chainsaw kit was 50 yards farther up at the trailhead. That was where we had been clearing for the road centerline. I had a 16-inch saw, a gallon can of bar oil, a half can of mixed fuel, and a road flare in the kit box. I made the kit. I dumped the bar oil first. I just turned the can over and let it run out onto the laurel at the downhill edge of the clearing, the side it was coming from. Then I dumped what was left of the mixed fuel on top of the oil. I worked the cap off the road flare with my left thumb, because the right hand was no good for fine work by then. The cap struck. The flare lit. It came down out of the canopy 10 feet in front of me. It came down hard, and it came down fast, and it landed in 4 points of contact and was already moving toward me when its feet hit the ground. I could see it clear in the open clearing. I am not going to describe it any more than I already have. Some things you see, you do not go back to. I dropped the flare into the spilled fuel. The laurel caught. That whole downhill slope went up in one slow whump. Not an explosion. A whump. Mountain laurel is full of resins. It burns hot and it burns sticky. The thing was 4 feet inside the burn line when it went up. It thrashed. It got tangled in the laurel branches. The laurel had it. It tried to climb out of the burn going up and got more tangled. I am not going to tell you the sound it made. I will say it was not a sound a man makes, and it was not a sound an animal makes. It was something in between. It went on for less than a minute. I crawled uphill in the smoke. I made it maybe 30 feet up the cove rim before I sat down because I could not stand anymore. I sat down with my back against a sweet gum, and I watched the laurel burn. I lost some time then. I want to be honest about that too. There is a stretch I cannot account for. I think I sat against the tree. I think I held my collarbone with my left hand. I think I said some words out loud that I would not say to my mother. The next clear thing I remember is Bishop's voice up the trail, shouting my name from a long way off. He had come back early. He told me afterward that he and Maddox had turned around shortly after they reached the trucks, because Bishop had a bad feeling and did not trust it. They had seen the smoke from a mile out, and they had left their truck on the road and run the last quarter mile up the cove. Bishop got to me first. He was carrying his county VHF radio in one hand and the truck's fire extinguisher in the other. He looked at me. He looked at the burn line. He did not ask. He just said, "Maddox, get the sheriff." Maddox ran back down the road with the radio. Bishop sat down next to me. He did not look at the laurel. He looked at the trail behind us, and he watched the trail behind us for a long time, and he did not move. He was waiting for it to come back. It did not come back. It was in the burn. What was left of it? I told him that. I told him it was dead. He nodded once and kept watching the trail. We sat there a long time until the air ambulance came down through the trees. I came out of surgery later that night at the regional hospital. They put a plate in my collarbone and 22 stitches under it. and 41 staples in my thigh. Bishop and Maddox were in the waiting room when I woke up. They did not ask me what I saw. They never asked. A few days later, a man named Templeton came by the hospital. He was the county search and rescue captain. He had worked the Tombigbee Hills drainages for 28 years. He sat down by the bed, listened to me describe what came out of the canopy, and when I was done, he was quiet for a long minute. Then he said, "Locals call it the lank. There has been a name for it since the 1880s, since a logging crew on Bear Creek lost 21 men over 14 seasons. He said an old forester at the district office had kept a 1956 newspaper clipping about it. Then he stood up and he went home. I have not been back into that cove since. The road project went through anyway. The dozers came in the next spring, and they pushed the center line right over the smokehouse pad and right through the burn scar where the laurel had been. I asked Bishop about it once, a year or so later. He said the burn site was clean. No bones in it. Nothing. He said it like a man who had looked. What stays with me is not the fight. What stays with me is the platform. I was up there with the camera at my face, and the thing was on the other side of the trunk. We both knew the other one was there. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I think about that part. The waiting. The way it let me decide whether to turn around. It wanted me to know it was there. That is the part I cannot put down.